In the year 2517, 75 children vanished from their bed. They were not taken by monsters nor by aliens from beyond the stars. They were taken by their own government, by the United Nations Space Command, by the Office of Naval Intelligence. These children, selected from among 39 billion DNA profiles scattered across humanity's colony world, possessed genetic markers that made them markers for strength, for agility, for aggression and intellect, markers that meant they would never see their family again. This is the story of the Spartan-II Program, not the sanitized version fed to the public in 2547 as a morale-boosting recruitment tool, not the propaganda that painted these warriors as volunteers, as heroes who willingly gave themselves to humanity's cause. This is the truth, the classified truth, the truth that Office of Naval Intelligence Section 3, buried beneath layers of redacted files, false documentation, and carefully constructed lies. It is a truth built on kidnapping, on the replacement of living children with flash clone duplicates engineered to die within months, on 8 years of brutal training stripped away childhood and replaced it, tactical doctrine and killing, on augmentation procedures that killed 30 children and crippled 12 more, on the calculated decision that the end just any means, no matter how morally unconscionable. The Spartan-II program was conceived by Dr. Catherine Halsey in the early 2510s as humanity teetered on the brink of civil war. The insurrection had grown beyond the UNSC's ability to contain it through conventional military force. Entire colony worlds were falling to separatist movement. The Carver findings, a classified intelligence report examining the political instability in the outer colonies, concluded that unless drastic measures were taken, humanity would tear itself apart in a massive internecine conflict. The Office of Naval Intelligence's own projections reached the same grim conclusion. The solution, Halsey argued, was not more soldiers, not more ships, not more conventional military might. The solution was a scalpel, small teams of perfectly trained, biologically augmented super soldiers who could accomplish what entire battalions could not. Surgical strikes to eliminate insurrectionist leadership, covert operations to destabilize rebel cells before they could gain momentum, psychological warfare that would make resistance seem futile. The original Orion project, initiated in the 24th century and deactivated in 2006, had proven that viable, if imperfect, those first-generation super soldiers, augmented as adults using primitive enhancement procedures, had shown effectiveness far beyond standard infant. But the program had suffered from high washout rate, limited effectiveness of adult augmentation, and an inability to scale to meet strategic needs. Halsey's proposal was different, radical, unethical, but she proposed taking children at the earliest possible age, before the onset of puberty, and subjecting them to a comprehensive program of training and augmentation that would forge them into the most effective warriors humanity had ever produced. The augmentations would be far more extensive than those attempted on Orion's subject. The training would begin in early childhood, allowing for psychological conditioning that would be impossible with adult volunteers. And therein lay the central moral compromise. There could be no volunteers. No 6-year-old child could meaningfully consent to what would be done to them. No parent would willingly surrender their son or daughter to such a program. Therefore, the children would be taken, stolen in the night, replaced with clones that would die slow, agonizing deaths from the genetic instabilities inherent in flash cloning technology, deaths that would appear to be tragic illnesses or accidents. The families would mourn, the children would be told their old lives no longer existed, and the UNSC would gain its super soldiers. When Halsey presented her proposal to Office of Naval Intelligence Section 3, she knew the ethical barriers were enormous. She also knew that in the calculus of institutional survival, ethics often took a backseat to necessity. The only leadership weighed the proposal not against moral philosophy, but against strategic reality. The insurrection was growing. Conventional military responses were becoming forceful and less effective. The outer colonies were sliding toward open rebellion. Without intervention, the projections suggested humanity would be embroiled in total civil war within a decade. 30 children dead in augmentation procedures, 12 crippled, 75 families destroyed by lies and manufactured grief. These were acceptable losses, the Oni brass concluded, if the alternative was the potential deaths of billions in a humanity-wide civil war. The Spartan-II Program received its authorization. Initial funding was approved for 300 candidates. This was later reduced to 150 due to budgetary constraints, then reduced again to 75 when Section 3's funding was diverted to other classified projects competing for resources within ONI's labyrinthine bureaucracy. Halsey and her team were told to make it work, 75 would have to be The selection process began. Using DNA samples collected through the Colonial Administration Authority's vaccination programs ostensibly designed for public health, but that doubled as genetic screening operation. Halsey's team analyzed 39 billion profiles. They were looking for specific markers, genetic indicators for superior physical attributes, certainly, but also for psychological traits, aggression, dominance, the ability to lead, the capacity for abstract tactical thinking, resilience, what Halsey termed in her personal journal as malleable, robust DNA structure and repair enzyme. From 39 billion profiles, 150 candidates were identified, children who possess the genetic potential to survive the augmentation procedures and excel under the training regimen. Children scattered across dozens of colony worlds, from the inner colonies to the outer territory. Children who had no idea that their DNA had been logged, analyzed, and marked for exploitation. The final selection of 75 from the 150 candidates was made through a combination of logistical feasibility and what Halsey would later describe in carefully clinical language. Some candidates lived in locations too difficult to access without raising suspicion. Others had family situations that would complicate the replacement operation. A few were selected because their physical profiles suggested they would be easier to match with flash clone. One candidate is known to have been left unchosen, Caleb Augard, who would have been designated Spartan-095. The reasons for his exclusion from the final section remain unclear, buried in files that have never been declassified. Between August 17th and September 23rd, 2517, 7 children disappeared. They ranged in age from 5 to 6 years old. All were healthy, active children. Many had been identified as gifted by their low education. Several were noted as athletic for their age. A few had already shown signs of natural leadership among their peer groups. They had names. They had family. They had futures that would never come to pass. They had friends who would grow up wondering what happened to them. Teachers who would mark their absence. Pets who would wait for masters who would never return home. Bedrooms that would remain untouched for months or years. Preserved by grieving parents who could not accept the loss. John, taken from the colony, were Eridanus II. Kelly from Imber. Linda from an agricultural settlement where she had spent her early years learning to hunt with her father. Samuel from a maritime colony where the ocean stretched deep to dark. Dozens more, each with their own story, their own that was stolen in a single night. The abduction protocols were clinical in their efficiency. ONI operatives trained in covert operations and child psychology identified the optimal extraction window for target, usually between midnight and 0300 hours when sleep would be deepest. The operatives would bypass security system where they exist with equipment decades ahead of anything available to civilian markets. They would enter the child's room, administer a fast-acting sedative, and extract the target within minutes. In the child's place, they left a flash clone. These clones were not perfect replicas. They could not be. Flash cloning technology allowed for the rapid growth of biological duplicates from genetic material, but the process introduced catastrophic genetic stability. The clones appeared identical to their originals externally, down to scars and birthmarks, carefully replicated through cellular scaffolding, but internally they were ticking time bombs. The clones' genetic structures were already beginning to break down at cellular level, even as they were placed in the children. Their telomeres were degraded. Their cellular repair mechanisms were compromised. Their organs, grown in days rather than years, carried subtle defects that would compound over time. Within weeks, the clones would begin to show symptoms: unusual fatigue, difficulty concentrating, in some cases, immune system failures that would manifest as recurring infection. Within months, most would develop more serious conditions: metabolic disorders, neurological problems, organ failures. All of the clones died, some within weeks, others lingered for months. A few survived nearly a year before succumbing to the inevitable cascade of medical crises that flash cloning created. To their families, these were tragic illnesses, rare genetic condition, terrible accident of biology that struck down young children in what should have been the prime of health. The families never knew, could never have known, that they buried clones while the real children, their actual sons and daughters, were being transformed into weapons light years away. The ethical implications of this deception are staggering. Halsey herself seems to have experienced some degree of internal conflict over the use of flash clone, though her personal journals frame it primarily in terms of operational security rather than moral philosophy. Admiral Margaret Perengosk, the head of ONA during this period, is recorded as having directly confronted Halsey about the clone protocol, though the specific details of that conversation remain classified. But the operation had been authorized at the highest levels of naval intelligence. The chain of command had signed off. The budgets had been allocated. The clones had been created and delivered. By the time any moral question might have derailed the program, 75 children were already in custody, sedated, and being transported through slipspace to the planet Reach. There was no turning back. Perhaps there never had been. The children woke in a barracks on Reach, a fleet military with no idea how they had arrived. Their last memories were of going to sleep in their own beds, in their own rooms, surrounded by the familiar comforts of home and family. They woke to gray walls, military cots arranged in precise rows, and the imposing figure of Chief Petty Officer Franklin Mendez standing at attention at the front of the room. Dr. Catherine Halsey addressed them first. She did not lie to them, not exactly, but neither did she tell them the full truth. She informed them that they had been selected for an important mission, that they were now part of the United Nations Space Command Defense Force, that they would be trained to defend Earth and all her colonies, that they could not return to their parents. She told them there would be hardship ahead. She told them they had been chosen because they were special. She told them that what they would accomplish would be extraordinary. She did not tell them they had been kidnapped. She did not tell them that flash clones were dying in their places. She did not tell them that 30 of them would die screaming in augmentation facilities 8 years hence. She did not tell them that the purpose for which they were being forged was to kill other humans, to suppress their own species' desire for self-determination. The children listened because they had no choice. They were 6 years old, alone, afraid, and surrounded by adults in military uniforms. They had no framework for understanding what was happening to them, no context for resistance. They knew only that everything familiar had been stripped away and replaced with something cold, foreign, and frightening. To marginalize the civilian lives they had once led, their call signs were established immediately, a combination of their first names and a numerical service tag. Second names, family names were discarded as irrelevant. John became John 117. Kelly became Kelly 087. Samuel became Samuel 034. The numbers served a dual purpose. They dehumanized, reducing individual identity to alphanumeric designations suitable for military record-keeping, but they also created a new form of identity, one tied not to family or birthplace, but to the program itself. The Spartans would come to define themselves by these numbers, to introduce themselves by these call signs, to think of themselves not as children stolen from homes, but as soldiers forged for purpose. It was the beginning of their transformation, the first step, a process that would strip away childhood and replace it with something darker, harder, and infinitely lethal. That their first night in the barracks, some of the children cried. A few tried to escape, only to be restrained and sedated. Others lay silently in their cots, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, trying to process what had happened. A handful, John 1:17 among them, seemed to accept their new reality with an adaptability that would later mark them as natural leaders. At 05:30 the next morning, Chief Petty Officer Franklin Mendez and his training instructors entered the barrack. They carried electric batons. Those children who did not immediately respond to the order to rise and proceed to the showers learned very quickly that hesitation carried constant training begun. To understand the Spartan-II program, one must first understand its predecessor. The original Orion project, sometimes referred to as the Spartan-I program in retrospect, was humanity's first organized attempt to create biologically augmented supersoldiers. Initiated in the 24th century, during the height of the insurrection, Orion represented both an ambitious scientific achievement and a cautionary tale about the limitation of augmenting adult subjects. The insurrection had been growing in intensity throughout the 24th, early 25th centuries. What began as isolated incidents of colonial unrest had metastasized into a full-scale separate movement. Outer colonies resent heavy-handed government perception that the inner treatment were increasingly willing to resort to violence to achieve independence. The United Nations Space Command found itself fighting a war of insurgency across dozens of worlds. Conventional military forces were effective at large-scale engagement, but struggled against guerrilla tactics. Hidden bases and terrorist cells melted into civilian The UNSC needed something different, something that could operate as small teams, strike with surgical precision, and accomplish objectives that entire battalions could not. The Orion project was born from this need. The program recruited adult volunteers from within the UNSC's Special Forces community. These were already elite soldiers, men and women who had proven themselves in combat, demonstrated exceptional physical and mental capabilities, and shown the psychological stability to handle high-stress operations. These volunteers were then subjected to a series of biomechanical augmentation procedures. The exact nature of these augmentations partially classified, but fragmentary records suggest they included muscular enhancement injection, increased tissue density, pulmonary respiratory enhancements to improve oxygen intake and to operate in low oxygen environment, retina inversion injections to improve visual acuity and night vision, and cochlea enhancement tuning to sharpen auditory sensitivity. The results were impressive by the standards of the time. Orion subjects showed significant improvement in strength, endurance, sensory, and reaction time. They performed well in special operations roles, conducting raids against insurrectionist target effectiveness that exceeded standard special forces teams, but the program also revealed significant limitation. The augmentation procedures applied to fully developed adult bodies could only produce modest improvements. The human body, once fully matured, proved resistant to radical modification. Skeletal structure was fixed. Muscle attachment points were established. Neural pathways were set. The augmentation could enhance what was already there, but they could not fundamentally redesign the object. Moreover, the psychological aspects of the program were problematic. Adult volunteers, no matter how dedicated, carried with them fully formed identities, personal lives, relationships, and moral framework. They could be trained and conditioned, but they could not be shaped from childhood. They retained a level of individual agent that sometimes conflicted with operational requirements. The washout rate was high. Not all volunteers responded well to the augmentation procedures. Some experienced adverse reaction. Others could not psychologically adapt to their enhanced capabilities. A few proved unable to handle the moral ambiguity of some operations, particularly those targeting fellow humans in the insurrection. By 2506, the Orion project was deactivated. The remaining Orion subjects were quietly reintegrated into conventional special forces units. The program was classified, its records sealed, its very existence removed from official documentation. To the outside world, Orion had never happened. But within the Office of Naval Intelligence, Orion was not considered a failure. It was considered a proof of concept. The program had demonstrated that biological augmentation could create soldiers of significantly enhanced capability. It had identified the procedures that worked and those did not. It had provided data on success rate, washout rate, and operational effectiveness. Most importantly, it had identified the central limitation. Adult augmentation could only go so far. If humanity wanted true super soldiers, warriors who could face any threat and prevail, the augmentation would need to be applied to subjects whose bodies still developing, subjects who could be molded and conditioned the early possible. Dr. Catherine Halsey, reviewing the Orion the early 2010s, saw the programs. She also saw it. She understood that to create the next generation of super soldiers, she would need to go further than Orion ever had, further in the scope of the augmentation, further in the intense, further in the ethical required to make the Orions adults who chose to go augment. Halsey's Spartans would be that lack, that complete control over the subjects from their earliest years would allow for a level of conditioning and modification that Orion could never have achieved. Some within ONI argued against revisiting the concept of super soldier. The insurrection, they contended, could be managed through convention. The cost and risk in other augmentation programs, particularly one in children, were too high to justify. But Dr. Halsey had the Carver finding on her side. That classified intelligence report examining political instability in outer colony painted a grim picture. Without dramatic intervention, the report concluded, humanity was heading toward a full-scale civil war that could shatter the UNSC and leave human space fractured and vulnerable. The Office of Naval Intelligence's own analysts reached similar conclusion. In that context, the argument for a new super soldier program became compelling. If small teams of highly effective operators could eliminate insurrectionist leadership, destabilize rebel movements, and conduct operations that would otherwise require battalion-level deployment, the program would pay for itself many times over in lives saved and worlds preserved. The question was not whether humanity needed a program. The question was whether humanity was willing to pay the ethical price, the moral cost of creating child soldiers through kidnapping, deception, the terrible calculus of sacrificing 75 children's normal lives and 30 of their actual lives in the hope of preventing a war that might kill billions. Office of Naval Intelligence, Section 3 decided that humanity was willing to pay that price, or more accurately, they decided they were willing to extract that price from 75 children and their families without asking for consent. The Spartan-II Program was authored. Dr. Catherine Halsey was given operational authority. Chief Petty Officer Franklin Mendez recruited to oversee training. Facilities were prepared on reach. Budgets were allocated. Flash cloning laboratories began production of the replacement. All the pieces were in place. All that remained was to select the children and then take them. To understand the Spartan-II program is to grapple with the figure of Dr. Catherine Halsey, brilliant, visionary, utterly committed to her work, and, by any conventional moral standard, a war criminal who authorized the kidnapping and transformation of children into weapons. Halsey was born on March 19, 2492, on the colony world Endymion. From an early age, she displayed extraordinary intellectual gifts. She completed her first doctorate at the age of 15, focusing on theoretical xenobiology. By her early 20s, she had accumulated multiple advanced degrees across disparate fields: astrophysics, bioengineering, artificial intelligence, and theoretical weapons development. The Office of Naval Intelligence recruited her in the early 2510s, recognizing that her particular combination of skills and moral flexibility made her ideally suited for a Section 3's work. Section 3 handled ONI's most classified program, the ones that existed in the gray zones of legality and ethics, the ones that asked not should we, but only can we, and what will it cost? Halsey fit Section 3 perfectly. She had the intellectual capacity to tackle problems that stumped other researchers. She had the ego to believe she knew better than the ethic framework that constrained others. And She had the detachment necessary to view human subjects' data points in a grand experiment rather than individuals with inherent rights and dignity. When she reviewed the Orion Project files, she saw immediately what needed to be changed. The augmentation procedures had been too conservative. The training had started too late. The subjects had retained too much of their pre-military identity. Orion had tried to enhance adult soldiers. Halsey would create warriors of childhood. Her proposal to ONI Section 3 was comprehensive. She outlined a program that would identify genetically superior children at age 5 to 6, abduct them, train them for 8 years in the most intensive military and academic curriculum ever designed, then subject them to augmentation procedures far more extensive than anything attempted. Orion's proposal included detailed technical specifications for the augmentation training protocol, project success rates, and cost. It also included the flash clone replacement. Halsey knew that 75 missing children would raise alarms and compromise programs. The solution was elegant in its horror: replace each child with a clone that would live long enough to prevent immediate investigation, but die soon enough to prevent long-term detection of the substitution. The families would mourn natural death. The UNSC would gain its warriors, and the secret would remain buried. When questioned about the ethical implications, Halsey's response was characteristically clinical. She framed the program in utilitarian terms. The lives and freedoms of 75 children weighed against the potential billions who would die in a full-scale human civil war. She pointed to the Carver finding, to ONI's projection, to the growing body count from insurrection violence. She argued that without dramatic intervention, humanity would destroy. Was she right? That question has haunted the Spartan-II program since its inception. The insurrection was indeed growing more violent. In the 2510, colonial unrest was escalating. The UNSC's conventional military responses were becoming increasingly forceful and decreasing effective. Perhaps a full-scale civil war was inevitable without intervention, but the Covenant War, which began in 2525, rendered the question moot. The Spartans, created to fight insurrectionists, instead became humanity's first line of defense against an alien genocidal campaign. The program that was justified as a way to prevent civil war instead became the scalpel that humanity wielded against an existential threat. Halsey would later point to this twist of fate as validation of her vision. The Spartans saved humanity, she would argue, not from itself, but from extinction. Without them, the Covenant would have swept through human space unopposed. Every world would have been glassed, every human killed or enslaved. The 75 children she took, the 30 who died in augmentation, the 12 who were crippled. These were acceptable losses compared to the billions the Spartans would save. It is a seductive argument. It is also deeply convenient for someone seeking to justify atrocities after. The truth is that Halsey created the Spartan-II program to fight human, not alien. The fact that the Spartans proved effective against the Covenant does not retroactively moralize the program's origin. Throughout the program's development and execution, Halsey maintained detailed personal journal. These documents, portions of which have been recovered and declassified in the post-war era, provide insight into her thinking. They reveal a woman of extraordinary intellect, certainly, but also one capable of remarkable self-deception. She writes about the Spartans with genuine affection, referring to them as her Spartans, expressing pride in their accomplishment. She notes their individual personality, their strength and weakness, their relationships with each. In some entries, she seems to view them almost as her children, a grotesque inversion, given that stole them from their actual parent. Yet she also writes with clinical detachment about their training and augmentation. She records mortality rates and washout percentages the way one might record data from a manufacturing process. She discusses the flash clone protocol matter-of-factly as an operational necessity rather than a moral catastrophe. The dichotomy is striking. Halsey seems capable of simultaneously viewing the Spartans as individuals she cares about and as experimental subjects whose suffering is regrettable but acceptable. This psychological compartmentalization appears to have been essential to her ability to continue the program. A person who fully internalized the moral implications of what she's doing might have been paralyzed by guilt. Halsey simply sectioned off those implications into a mental compartment she did not need to access while working. Her relationship with the Spartans, the children came to view her as a maternal figure, a source of stability in their regimented and often brutal lives. She visited them during training, observed their progress, and provided what passed for encouragement, approval in the context of the program. She was, in many ways, the closest thing to a mother most of them would remember, but she was also the architect of their suffering. Every painful procedure, every training exercise that pushed them past their limits, every psychological manipulation designed to strip away their civilian identities, all of it flowed from protocols she designed. She watched children die in augmentation chambers and recorded their deaths in her journals with clinical precision. She authorized the flash cloning that killed 75 genetic duplicates. She made the decisions that transformed children into weapons. Did she experience guilt? Her journals suggest she did, though she framed it in terms of burden rather than regret. She wrote that she carried the weight of her decisions, that the fate of humanity rested on the program's success, that the moral cost was hers to bear. This framing allowed her to view herself as tragic rather than monstrous, the brilliant scientist forced by necessity to make terrible choices for the greater good. It is a self-serving narrative. It positions her as the heroine of her own story, the one person brave enough to do what needed to be done, while others wrung their hands about ethics. It absolves her of moral responsibility by appealing to utilitarian calculus and strategic necessity. The reality more complicated and less flattering. Catherine Hall's a person of extraordinary gifts who chose to use those gifts to commit atrocity. She was enabled by an institutional structure, ONI Section 3, that encouraged moral flexibility and rewarded result over ethics. She operated in an environment where the ends were believed to justify any means, where human rights could be suspended for strategic advantage, where children could be viewed as acceptable experimental subjects if the potential payoff was high enough. She was brilliant. She was dedicated. She was convinced of her own righteousness. And she was, by any reasonable standard, a monster. That she came to care about the Spartans does not excuse what she did to create them. That the Spartans succeeded beyond her wildest projections does not retroactively moralize creation. That humanity benefited from her crimes does not erase the criminality. Years later, after the Covenant War had ended, Halsey would face some measure of accountability. She was interrogated by Admiral Margaret Perengoski about her role in the program, particularly the Flash Clone Protocol. She was, for a time, considered a war criminal by some within ONI, but she was never prosecuted, never imprisoned. The Spartans she created were too valuable, her knowledge too critical, her brilliance too useful. She remained essential to the UNSC's efforts, working on advanced projects, advising on Spartan-related matters, contributing to humanity's defense. The woman who had stolen 75 children and killed 30 more through experimental procedures, remained at the heart of humanity's military scientific establishment. Perhaps that is the most disturbing aspect of the entire story. Not that Catherine Halsey did what she did, but that she was allowed to do it, supported in doing it, and ultimately never held accountable for doing it. The institutions that empowered her, the command structure that authorized her program, the society that benefited from her crime, all of them share complicity in what was done to those children. Catherine Halsey is the architect of the Spartan-II Program, but she did not work alone. She could not have worked alone. Every Spartan that took the field, every mission they accomplished, every life they saved, all of it rests the foundation of 75 stolen childhoods and 30 dead children. That is the price humanity paid for its super soldiers. That is the cost Spartan-II Program. The selection of Spartan-II candidates was one of the most comprehensive genetic screening operations ever conducted by the United Nations Space Command. Beginning in the early 2510s, Dr. Catherine Halsey and her team began analyzing DNA profiles collected through the Colonial Administration Authority's vaccination programs, data that represented virtually every child born in human-controlled space over a 5-year period. From 39 billion individual genetic profiles, Halsey's selection protocols would identify 150 candidates, and from those 150, only 75 would be taken. The genetic markers Halsey was searching for were specific and demanding. She was not simply looking for healthy children or even exceptional children by conventional standards. She was looking for children whose genetic structures suggested they could survive the augmentation procedures that Orion's subjects had struggled with, while simultaneously possessing the psychological and physical traits necessary to become perfect soldiers. The physical markers were the most straightforward to identify. Halsey's screening algorithms searched for genetic indicators of superior skeletal density, which would be crucial for surviving the carbide ceramic ossification procedure. They looked for markers associated with higher than average fast-twitch muscle fiber ratios, suggest superior strength and speed potential. They identified genetic variants associated with efficient oxygen utilization, cardiovascular health, and superior neural connectivity. But Halsey understood that physical superiority alone would not create effective soldiers. She needed psychological traits as well. Her screening protocols searched for genetic markers associated with aggression, not uncontrolled violence, but the capacity for controlled, directed hostility when necessary. She looked for indicators of dominance, the personality traits that would allow certain candidates to naturally assume leadership roles. She sought evidence of resilience, the ability to endure hardship without psychological breakdown. Perhaps most controversial, she specifically screened for intellectual capacity. Halsey did not want mindless soldiers who would simply follow orders. She wanted warriors capable of tactical thinking, strategic and rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. Spartans needed to be as intelligent as they were strong, as tactically brilliant as they were physically capable. The screening protocols also looked for what Halsey termed malleable, robust DNA structure and repair enzyme. This was a measure of genetic stability and the body's capacity for repair at the cellular level. Children with genetic structures prone to mutation or with impaired DNA repair mechanisms would be less likely to survive the trauma of augmentation. Those whose genetic profiles suggested superior cellular repair capacity would have better odds. One genetic marker that was explicitly screened against was susceptibility to autoimmune disorders. The augmentation procedures would place extreme stress on the immune system. Any candidate whose genetic profile suggested elevated risk of autoimmune response would be eliminated from consideration. Similarly, markers for genetic diseases, neurological disorders, or metabolic conditions resulted in automatic disqualification. The screening process was entirely without consent. The children whose DNA was being analyzed had no knowledge of it. Their parents had no knowledge of it. The vaccination programs through which genetic material was collected were presented as straightforward public health initiatives. The secondary use of that data for military recruitment, for the identification of children to be abducted for super soldier transformation, was never disclosed. It is worth noting the scale of this surveillance: 39 billion profiles. That represented virtually every child born in UNSC space over a multi-year period across dozens of colony worlds from the inner colonies to the outer territories. The data storage alone would have required massive computing resources. The analysis would have consumed months of processing time, even with the most advanced artificial intelligence systems available to ONI. The effort speaks to how serious the Office of Naval Intelligence took the threat. This is not a pilot program or a limited experiment. This was a comprehensive attempt to identify absolute best genetic candidate from human higher power. No expense spared. No privacy concern was allowed to interfere. The entire galaxy-spanning bureaucracy of the Colonial Administration Authority was repurposed without its knowledge to serve as a genetic screening operation for ONI's black programs. From 39 billion profiles, the screening protocols identified 150 candidates who met all the criteria. These children were scattered across human space. Some lived in the inner colony, in urban centers where their disappearance would be noticed quickly. Others came from outer colony agricultural worlds where communities were smaller and more isolated. A few were from spacecraft, orbital station, children of spacers who lived their entire life in transit. Each of the 150 candidates was assigned a preliminary Spartan designation. Dossiers were prepared detailing their family situations, their home environments, their daily routine. ONI Section 3 began planning the logistics of potential abduction operation, which children could be extracted cleanly, which extractions would be too risky or too likely to raise alarm. Then came the budgetary reality. The program had initially been funded for 300 candidates. When that was reduced to 150, Halsey and her team had adjusted their plan, but final funding came in even lower, 75 candidates, half of the already reduced number. Halsey was told to make it work, the decision of which 75 children would be taken from the 150 identified appears to have been made through a combination of logistical considerations and potentially simple random select. Halsey's personal journals mention the single flip of a coin in determining which candidates would be weeded out, though whether this is metaphorical or literal remains unclear. What is known is that geographical distribution played a role. ONI needed to spread the abductions across multiple colony worlds to avoid creating a pattern that might raise alarm. 75 children disappearing from a single world would trigger investigation. 75 children disappearing from 75 different worlds, each replaced with a clone that would die of apparently natural causes, would be lost. Statistical noise, childhood mortality, family situation was also considered. Children from military families were avoided where possible, as military parents would be more likely to push for investigation. Children whose families had connections to political power were similarly avoided. The ideal candidates came from middle-class families with no particular influence or connection, families that would grieve but lacked the resource to challenge physical resemblance to available clone templates may have also played a role. Flash cloning technology allowed for the creation of genetic duplicates, but those duplicates needed to be aged to match the target subject. The more unusual a child's appearance, the more difficult it would be to create a convincing place. Children with more common physical characteristics would be easier to. One candidate who is definitely known to have been left behind was Caleb Allgard, who would have been designated Spartan-095. The circumstances of his exclusion remain classified, but his existence proves that at least one child passed all genetic screening only to be removed from final select. There may have been others whose names are lost to classified file. By mid-2017, the final 75 had been chosen. They ranged in age from 5 to 6 years old. The gender distribution was roughly even, with the exact numbers remaining classified. They came from dozens of different worlds and represented a cross-section genetic diversity. Some had light skin, dark. Some had Earth's European. Others from African, Asian, or mixed heritage. Haircuts range from pale blonde to deep black. Eye colors span spectrum from pale blue to deep brown. What they all shared were the genetic markers that Halsey had been searching. They were, by design, the genetic cream of humanity. Crop strongest, fast, most intelligent, most aggressive, most resilient children could be identified from a population of 39 billion. They also shared another characteristic. None of them had any choice in what was about to happen to them. Between August 17th and September 23rd, 2517, Office of Naval Intelligence operatives moved into position across humans. Extraction teams were briefed. Clone deliveries were staged, sedatives were prepared, timelines were synchronized, and then, one by one, 75 children vanished from their bed. The extractions were executed with clinical precision. Each team had been provided detailed intelligence on their target's home environment, family routine, security measures, and local emergency response capability. They knew the layout of each house or apartment. They knew where the child's bedroom was located. They knew what time the child typically would sleep. They knew which family members might wake if sounds were made. Most extractions took less than 5 minutes from breach to exfiltration. Operatives would bypass locks using electronic countermeasures decades ahead of civilian security technology. They would move through the dwelling silently, using night vision equipment to navigate without activating light. They would enter the child's room, administer the fast-acting sedative, usually via hypodermic injection carotid artery for instant effect, and extract the now unconscious child through the same entrance they had used. In the child's place, they would position a flash clone that had been aged to match the target subject's exact age and physical appearance. The clone would be dressed in identical clothing, placed in the same sleeping position, covered with the same blankets. To any parent checking on their child in the night, nothing would appear. By the time the sedative wore off, the real child would be in a transport vehicle heading for a secure extraction point. Within hours, they would be loaded onto ONI vessels for slip-space transit to reach. Most were placed in cryosleep the journey, preventing them from building memories of the extraction that might complicate later conditions. A few children fought the sedation long enough to catch glimpses of the extraction. ONI psychological assessments predicted this would occur in approximately 8 to 10% of cases, and those children would retain fragmented memories of being taken. The psychological conditioning protocols were specifically designed to suppress or recontextualize such memories, framing them as dreams or childhood nightmares rather than actual events. Did any of the families notice that their child seemed different after that night? Did any parents sense that the child they tucked into bed the next evening was not quite the same as the one kissed goodnight 24 hours earlier? The psychological literature on parental bonding suggests that parents develop extraordinarily sensitive attunement to their children's behaviors, mannerisms, and emotional states. A clone, no matter how genetically identical, would not have the same memory, the same experience, the same eternal life as the original. There is fragmentary evidence some families did notice changes. Medical records from several of the families whose children were replaced show visits to pediatricians in the weeks following the extraction, with parents reporting that their child seemed off or not quite themselves. Doctors uniformly attributed these concerns to normal childhood development, perhaps exacerbated by stress or illness. Within months, when the clones began showing the first symptoms of genetic breakdown, those earlier parental concerns were recontextualized as premonitions or early warning signs of the illness that would eventually claim the child's life. The parent's intuition that something was wrong was validated, but in a way that supported the deception rather than exposed. The 75 families grieved 75 different deaths over the following months and years. Some clones died quickly, within weeks, their systems failing catastrophically. Others lingered for nearly a year before succumbing. The causes of death varied based on which genetic systems failed first. Metabolic disorders, immune system collapse, neurological deterioration, organ failure. Each death appeared tragic but explicable. Rare genetic condition, aggressive childhood cancer, unexplained failures of otherwise healthy body, the kind of random medical catastrophes that, while statistically unlikely, do occur in any sufficiently large population. No investigation ever connected the deaths. They occurred on different worlds, months apart, attributed to different causes. There was no pattern to detect. No reason to suspect that 75 childhood deaths spread across dozens of colonies over several years were anything other than terrible but natural occurrence. Meanwhile, the real children woke on reach to begin their transformation into weapons. John remembers falling asleep in his own bed on Eridanus II. He remembers the familiar comfort of his room, the weight of his blanket, the distant sound of his parents' voices from somewhere else in the house. He remembers the security of home, the certainty that he would wake the next morning to another ordinary day. He does not remember the extract, the sedative sought. His last memory before waking on Reach is of closing his eyes in his own room. His first memory after is of opening them in a barrack filled with strangers. The disorientation was profound. John 1:17 would later describe it in debriefing sessions as feeling like reality itself had shifted, as though he had fallen asleep in one world and awakened in another. The room was wrong. The sounds were wrong. The smells were wrong. Everything that should have been familiar was absent, replaced by the cold functionality of military architecture and the presence of dozens of other confused, frightened children. He was not alone in his confusion. 74 other children experienced the same jarring transition from sleep to waking, from home to military installation, from freedom to captivity. Their reactions varied based on personality and circumstance, but all shared the fundamental experience of having their reality shattered without warning or explanation. Some children cried. They called for parents who would never come, begged to go home, to places they would never see again. The crying started as soon as the first children woke and continued in waves as more regained consciousness. The sound of 70 children discovering they had been taken from everything they knew created a chorus of anguish that echoed through the barrack. Others responded with anger. A few attempted to fight, lashing out at the uniformed adults who stood watch over them. These attempts were ineffective. What can a 6-year-old do against trained military personnel? But they represented the children's desperate need to assert some agency over a situation in which they had none. The anger would later be channeled, redirected, weaponized as part of their training. But in those first hours, it was simply the rage children who understood, however dimly, that something terrible had been done to them. A smaller number responded with silence. These children, John among them, seemed to instinctively understand that crying and fighting would change. They watched, they assessed, they tried to understand where they were and why. This capacity for rapid adaptation to dire circumstance was part of what the genetic screening had identified. These were children whose psychological profiles suggested they would survive trauma and emerge functional rather than broken. It is important to understand that none of these responses were wrong. There is no correct way for a 6-year-old child to react to being kidnapped by their own government. Crying, fighting, and silent assessment were all valid reactions to an impossible situation. The fact that Oni's psychological conditioning would later reward certain responses and punish others does not make those responses inherently better. It simply means that some psychological profiles were more useful to the program than others. Kelly 087 remembers trying to run. She does not remember much of the extraction itself, but she remembers waking in the barracks and immediately attempting to find an exit. She made it as far as the door before being restrained by training instructors. She fought with surprising strength for a child her size, scratching, biting, and kicking until a second sedative was administered. She woke hours later in the same barrack, secured to her cot with restraints that were released only after she agreed to remain calm. Her attempted escape was not unique. Several children tried to flee in those first hours, operating on pure instinct to return to safety. None succeeded. The barracks had been specifically designed to contain the candidates during their initial adjustment period. Doors were locked and guarded. Windows were small and reinforced. Even if a child had managed to escape the building, they would have found themselves in the middle of a military camp on an unfamiliar world. Light years from home, Samuel 034 remembers the moment he realized parents were not. He had been crying for perhaps calling for his mother when one of the training instructors, not Mendez, but one of the junior trainers, told him bluntly that his parents were not there, that he would not be seeing them again, that this was home. Samuel stopped crying, not because he had accepted the situation, but because he understood that crying would not change it. That realization that no amount of distress would bring rescue marked a turning point for many of the children. It was the moment when they began to understand that they were truly alone, that the adults in their lives had either abandoned them or been powerless to protect them. The first day was chaos. 75 traumatized children in a single space, each processing their situation differently, each desperately trying to make sense of what had happened. The training instructors maintained order through a combination of commands, threats, and, when necessary, physical restraint. Several children were sedated when their distress became unmanageable. Others were separated temporarily when they became violent towards staff or each other. By the evening of that first day, Dr. Catherine Halsey arrived to address. She stood at the front of the barracks, dressed in civilian clothes that contrasted sharply with the uniforms of the military personnel surrounding her. She looked at the assembled children with an expression that some would later describe as sympathetic, others as calculating, and still others as both simultaneous. She told them they had been chosen, that they were special, that they were now part of the United Nations Space Command Defense Force, that they would be trained to defend Earth and all her colonies, that they could not return to their parent, that they would become something greater they could have. She did not tell them they had been kidnapped. She did not tell them about the Flash. She did not tell them that 30 of them would die in 8 years. She did not tell them the truth about why they had been taken. Instead, she framed their abduction as selection, their captivity as opportunity, their victimization as privilege. It was a masterful piece of psychological manipulation designed to begin the process of recontextualizing their trauma as purpose. If the children could be made to believe they had been chosen rather than stolen, if they could be made to feel special rather than victimized, they would be easier to condition. Some of the children were receptive to this framing. Those who came from difficult home situations, from poverty or abuse or instability, found it easier to accept they had been selected for something better. The idea that special that they had chosen provided a narrative framework that made their situation slightly more bearable. Others were not receptive at all. Children from loving, stable homes had no framework for understanding why being taken from their families could possibly be an improvement. Halsey's words sounded like lies because they were lies, and some children's psychological profiles made them resistant to such obvious manipulation. But receptive or not, all of the children were in the same situation. They were on reach, light years from any home they had known. They were surrounded by military personnel in a secure facility. They had no means of escape and no prospect of rescue. Whether they accepted Halsey's framing or rejected it, they were Spartans now. The program would continue regardless of their consent. Chief Petty Officer Franklin Mendez introduced himself next. Where Halsey had been maternal in her approach, Mendez was paternal but stern. He told them he would be their instructor, that they would train every day, that the training would be hard, but that it would make them strong, that they were soldiers, and soldiers followed orders. Then he told them their names, not the names they had been born with. Those names, Mendez explained, were from their old life. They were Spartan. Each would be identified by their first name and a service. John became John 117. Kelly became Kelly 08. Samuel became Samuel 034. The elimination of surnames was not accidental. Family names connect individuals to lineage, to ancestry, to communities and histories exist outside of military structure. By stripping away surnames and replacing them with numbers, Oni began the process of severing the children's connection to their pre-Spartan identity. The numbers also served another purpose. They dehumanized. A person named John Smith is an individual with family connections and personal history. A person designated John 117 is a military asset with a service number. The shift in nomenclature was subtle, profound. It signaled to the children that their old identities were being replaced with new ones, that they were no longer civilian soldiers, no longer children, but resource. Some of the children tried to resist this reframing. They insisted on using their full names when addressing. They talked about family, their home, their life. These attempts to preserve pre-Spartan identity were viewed by the training staff as problems to be corrected through conditioning. Others accepted the new designation quickly. They began introducing themselves by their call signs, referring to each other by numbers rather than names. This acceptance was not necessarily healthy. It represented the beginning of their psychological transformation from abducted children to child soldiers. But it was what the program required. That first night, after Halsey and Mendez had left, the children were allowed to talk amongst themselves. The training instructors withdrew to the edges of the barracks, maintaining surveillance, not actively interfering. It was a deliberate choice designed to allow the children to begin forming social bonds that would later be leveraged as part of their training. Some children gravitated toward each other based on similarity. Those who were crying found comfort in shared distress. Those who were angry formed small groups unified by resentment. Those who were confused sought out others who seemed to have a better grasp of the situation. John 1:17 found himself the center of one such group. Other children approached him, drawn by something in his demeanor that suggested competence or leadership or simply confidence. He did not have answers. He was as lost as any of them, but he projected a calmness that others found reassuring. This was the beginning of John's emergence as the leader of the Spartan-IIs. It was not appointed by the training staff. It was not mandated by program protocols. It emerged organic, the social dynamic of 75 traumatized children trying to make sense of their situation. John became the one others looked to for guidance, for reassurance, for the illusion that someone among them understood what was happening. Years later, after the training was complete and the augmentations had been performed and the survivors had been deployed against the Covenant, John would be recognized the de facto leader, Spartan-II. But that leadership began on the first in a barrack, confused and frightened children, when others instinctively turned to him for something they could not articulate but desperately needed. By the time the lights were dimmed and the children were ordered to sleep, some semblance of order had been established. The crying had largely stopped. Exhaustion, overcoming distress, the attempted escapes had been thwarted and would not be repeated. The children had begun to understand that their situation was permanent, that there would be no rescue, that this was their life now. They slept fitfully that first night, disturbed by nightmares and the unfamiliarity of their surroundings. Some woke crying, others woke disoriented, briefly forgetting where they were before the reality crashed back over them. The training instructors moved through the barracks throughout the night, maintaining watch, ready to intervene if any child became disruptive. At 05:30 the next morning, Chief Petty Officer Mendez and his training instructors entered the barrack. They carried electric batons. They began shouting orders for the children to rise, to move to the showers, to prepare for the day's training. Those children who responded quickly found the transition jarring but manageable. Those who hesitated, whether from confusion or defiance or simple exhaustion, received a shock from the electric baton. Not enough to cause lasting harm. The program needed the children healthy, but enough to ensure immediate compliance. It was a brutal introduction to military discipline. 6-year-old children being shocked, forced into showers, ordered to dress in identical gray uniforms, assemble in formation inspection. Several children down during this process. They were shocked again, ordered to stop. The message clear. Crying was not permitted. Fear was not permitted. Anything except immediate obedience was not permitted. This was not training. Not yet. This was condition. The first step in breaking down civilian identity and replacing it with military discipline. The children were being taught that they had no agency, no autonomy, no control over their own lives. They were learning that resistance brought pain and compliance brought safety. By the end of that first morning, after showers and uniform inspection, and a breakfast eaten in silence under the watchful eyes of the training instructors, the children had begun to understand the fundamental reality of their new existence. They were property of the UNSC. They would do what they were told. They would become what the program required them to become. They had no choice. They had never had a choice. That realization, settling into 75 young minds over the course of days and weeks, marked the true beginning of their transformation. They had been children once. Now they were becoming something else. Now They were becoming Spartan, while 75 children woke on reach to begin their transfer. 75 families across human space woke to find their children still in their beds. The clones breathed, they moved, they opened their eyes, spoke, and ate breakfast, and went about their day. To external observation, they were indistinguishable from the children they had replaced, but they were dying. Flash cloning technology, the 26th century, was advanced but fundamentally flawed. The process could create a genetic duplicate of a human being in a matter of days, growing the clone cellular material to full size through accelerated development protocol. The resulting clone would be physically identical to the original down to the cellular level, possessing the same genetic structure, the same physical features, the same scars and birthmarks. What the process could not replicate was genetic stability. The accelerated growth process introduced cascading errors into the clone's DNA. Telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes that normally degrade slowly over a lifetime, were shortened dramatically. Cellular repair mechanisms were compromised. Organs grown in days rather than years carried subtle structural defects that would compound over time. The clones were not meant to live long lives. They were created for a single purpose: to prevent immediate investigation into the children's disappearances. They needed to live long enough that parents would not immediately suspect foul play, but die soon enough that they could not develop too far from their original templates, which would make discrepancies apparent. Oni's bioengineers had calculated the optimal lifespan for the Flash clone based on these requirements. The target was 3 to 6 months, though individual variation meant some clones died much sooner while others survived longer. All would eventually succumb to the genetic instabilities inherent in their creation. The families had no idea. How could they? The child in their home looked exactly like their son or daughter, sounded like them, shared their memories up to the point of the extraction. The cloning process captured not just physical structure, but neural pattern, at least superficially. The clones did not know they were clones. They believed they were the original children, but within days, the differences began to manifest. Subtle at first, the clone might seem tired more easily than before, might have difficulty focusing on tasks that had previously been easy, might complain of vague physical discomfort that parents attributed to growing pains or the onset of illness. Many families consulted doctors during this period. Medical records from several families whose children were replaced show pediatric visits in the weeks immediately following the extraction, with parents reporting concerns that their child seemed different or not quite right. Doctors found nothing obviously wrong at standard examination. Blood work might show slightly elevated white blood cell count, suggest immune response, unknown pathogen, but nothing diagnosed. The parents' intuition that something was wrong was correct, but the medical establishment had no framework for recognizing Flash clone degeneration. The condition did not exist in medical literature. The symptoms were too vague and varied to suggest a specific diagnosis, and the idea that a child might be a rapidly aging clone was so far outside normal diagnostic frameworks as to be literally unthinkable. As weeks passed, the symptoms intensified. The clones became lethargic. Many developed recurring infections as their compromised immune system struggled to fight off even common pathogens. Some began experiencing cognitive difficulty, memory problems, difficulty learning new information, confusion about recent events. Parents grew increasingly alarmed. More doctor visits followed. More tests were ordered. Blood work showed increasing abnormal. Immune panels suggested autoimmune disorders. Metabolic tests revealed organ functions declining for no apparent reason. By the second or third month, most clones were obviously ill. The specific manifestations varied based on which organ systems were failing first. Some developed what appeared to be aggressive leukemia, as their bone marrow's ability to produce healthy blood cells collapsed. Others showed signs of liver or kidney failure. Some experienced neurological deterioration that resembled early-onset neurodegenerative diseases. Doctors were baffled. Healthy 6-year-old children did not spontaneously develop multiple organ failures. They did not present with symptoms suggesting their bodies were aging decades in months. The medical teams treating these cases found themselves confronting conditions they had never seen before, with disease progressions that made no biologic sense. Some families sought second opinions. Others traveled to specialized medical centers on more developed worlds, hoping that access to more advanced technology might provide answers. A few even contacted UNSC medical services, thinking that military doctors might have access to better diagnostic tools. None of it mattered. The clones were dying, and nothing could stop. The genetic instabilities were too fundamental, the cellular breakdowns too comprehensive. Attempts to treat individual symptoms, antibiotics for infection, transfusions for blood disorders, supportive care for organ failure, bought time but could not address the underlying. The clones themselves were confused, frightened. They did not understand why they were sick. From their perspective, they had been healthy children who suddenly became ill with a mysterious condition that doctors could not cure. Some of the clones, particularly those who lived longer, began to suspect that something was fundamentally wrong with their existence, that they were not who they believed themselves to be. There are fragmentary reports mentioned in classified ONI documents of at least 2 clones expressing awareness of their nature before death. One is recorded as telling parents, "I don't think I'm really your child." Another apparently drew pictures in a hospital room depicting 2 versions of themselves, one labeled real and one labeled not real. These incidents were attributed by medical staff to confusion caused by fever or neurological decline. By the 6-month mark, most of the clone had died. A few lingered longer, 8 months, 10 months, in one case nearly a full year, but all eventually succumbed. The causes of death varied: multi-organ failure, immune system collapse, infections that overwhelmed compromised, strokes, or cardiac events caused by cascading system failure. Each death was a tragedy to the family's experience. Parents who had watched their healthy child decline over months despite the best efforts of medical science. Siblings who lost brothers and sisters. Extended family members who grieved. Communities that rallied around families facing unthinkable loss. Funerals were held. Children were buried or cremated. Families tried to process their grief and move forward with their lives. Many struggled with guilt, wondering if they had missed warning signs or failed to get adequate medical care soon enough. Others grappled with anger at a universe that would allow such random, senseless tragedy. Support groups formed in some communities, particularly on worlds where multiple families had lost children to similar mysterious. Parents compared notes, shared their experience, searched for patterns that might explain why children had been taken. They found similarity: the sudden onset, the baffling array of symptoms, the failure of medical science to provide answers, but no explanation. Some families never recovered from the loss. Marriages dissolved under the strain. Parents descended into depression or substance abuse. Siblings developed psychological issues stemming from the trauma of watching a brother or sister slowly die. The ripple effects of each clone's death extended through families and community, creating waves of suffering that would persist for years or lifetimes. And all of it was based on a lie. The children these families mourned were not dead. They were on reach, undergoing transformation into super soldiers. The bodies buried or cremated were those of clones created for the sole purpose of providing cover for Oni's abduction. When 2 of the actual Spartan candidates, whose identities remain classified, later encountered information about the Flash clone protocol, committed suicide. The realization that their families had mourned clone duplicates, that their parents had watched those die, believing they were the real children, was too much to bear. They chose death over the knowledge of what had been done in their It is difficult to state the enormity of the Flash clone. This was not simply kidnapping, though that would have been crime enough. This was a systematic campaign of deception that involved the creation of 75 living beings designed to die. Deaths that would cause psychological devastation to hundreds of family members and community members. Every person who grieved a clone's death was experiencing real trauma based on a manufactured tragedy. Every parent who watched their child die slowly was being tortured by Oni's lies. Every sibling who lost a brother or sister was scarred by loss that never needed to happen. The Flash clones themselves were victims, perhaps even more tragic than the children they replaced. They were created without consent, given brief lives filled with confusion and suffering, and died without ever understanding what they truly were. They were living beings possessing consciousness and the capacity to suffer, brought into existence solely to serve as disposable props in Oni's deception. Did they have soul? Did they deserve the same moral consideration as any other human being? These questions never seem to have troubled the Oni personnel who authorized and executed the protocol. The clones were tools, nothing more. Their suffering was acceptable. Their deaths were necessary. In the cold calculus of institutional utility, they simply did not matter. Catherine Halsey, in her personal journals, expressed some discomfort with the Flash clone protocol. She wrote about the necessary evil of deception, about her recognition that the families would experience terrible, about her hopes that the Spartans created would justify the sacrifices. But she never questioned whether the protocol should be implemented, never suggested an alternative, never refused to participate. Admiral Margaret Perengoski confronted Halsey about the Flash clone in at least one documented interaction, though the details remain classified. Perengoski herself had authorized the protocol, so her concern was likely operational rather than the question was not whether the clone should have been used, but whether deception would hold, whether any investigation might pierce the veil and expose what had been done. The deception held. To this, the families who lost children to Flash clone degeneration do not know the truth. They believe they suffered random, tragic loss, that their children fell victim to rare genetic conditions or inexplicable catastrophe. They carry grief for children who are not actually dead, who may in some cases have survived the Covenant War and still walk among humanity's defenders. There have been no public revelation about the Flash clone protocol, no investigation, no accountability. The families were never told. The communities never learned. The doctors who treated dying clones never discovered what their patients truly were. The secret remains buried in Oni's classified, hidden behind layers of security clearance, protected by the same institutional structures that enabled the crime first. It will likely remain buried for generations, if not forever, because to reveal the truth would be to force humanity to confront what was done in its name, to force 75 families to realize that their children did not die, that they were stolen, that the bodies they buried were cloned, that somewhere in the UNSC their actual sons and daughters still live, transformed into weapons, stripped of their original identities, believing they can never return home. That revelation would break people, would shatter the trust that citizens of the UNSC place in their government, would raise questions about what other atrocities Oni has committed in the name of security. So the secret remains. The families grieve, and the Spartans, those who survived, carry the knowledge of what was done to make them. Some, like John 1:17, seem to have made peace with it, accepting that they cannot change the past and can only move forward. Others struggle with guilt, with anger, with the impossible question of whether they were worth the price paid in their name. There is no good answer to that question, no calculus that can weigh 75 stolen childhoods, 30 dead Spartans, 12 crippled Spartans, 75 dead clones, and hundreds of traumatized family members against the worlds the Spartans saved from the Covenant. The families were victims, clones were victims. The children who became Spartans were victims. All were sacrificed on the altar of strategic necessity. All paid the price for humanity's survival. Whether that price was worth paying is a question each person must answer for themselves. The transformation from kidnapped child Spartan super soldier required 8 years of the most intensive military training program ever devised by human. From 2517 to 2525, 75 children lived, trained, and suffered in the Fleetcom military complex on Reach and its surrounding facility. Every day was designed to strip away civilian weakness and replace it with military efficiency. Every X pushed them beyond children capable of enduring. Every lesson drilled into them that they were no longer individual but weapon. Chief Petty Officer Franklin Mendez, Service Number 229261198 FM, was the architect and overseer of a career military, decades experience training special forces. Mendez had been hand-selected by Catherine Halsey to turn her genetic masterpieces into functional soldiers. He approached the task with grim determination and an iron discipline that would define the Spartans for the rest of their lives. Mendez's training philosophy was brutal but not sadistic. He did not abuse the children for the pleasure of watching them suffer. Every hardship had a purpose. Every punishment taught a lesson. Every seemingly impossible challenge was calibrated to push the candidate to their absolute limits without breaking them entirely. He was creating warriors who would face horrors beyond imagination, and he believed that the training must be nearly as harsh as the reality they would eventually confront. But he was also, in his own way, protective of his charges. He taught them not just how to kill, but the difference between right and wrong. He instilled discipline alongside honor, obedience alongside moral responsibility. He wanted them to be effective killers, certainly, but also to be soldiers who understood duty, loyalty, and the weight of the power they would wield. The children came to view Mendez as a father figure, albeit stern and demanding. He was the one constant in their lives during the 8 years training. While instructors and support staff rotated through assignments, Mendez remained. He watched them grow from confused 6-year-olds into hardened 14-year-olds ready for augmentation. He knew each of them individually, understood their strength and weakness, pushed buttons he knew would motivate or educate them. In later years, after the Covenant War had begun and the Spartans had proven themselves in combat, some would speak of Mendez' affection, others with respect, a few with resentment for what he put them through, but all recognized that without his training, they would not have survived their first encounters with the Covenant. The daily routine began at 0530 every morning. Mendez and his training instructors entered the barracks with electric batons and shouted orders to rise. The Spartans learned quickly that hesitation brought pain. They rolled out of their cot, moved to the showers, completed their morning ablutions with military efficiency. Any candidate who lagged behind or failed to maintain the pace received a shock that ensured better performance the next morning. After showers, the physical training began. 100 repetitions each of jumping jack, sit-up, deep squat, knee bend, and leg lift for 6-year-old children. This was an enormous physical demand. Many struggled to complete the sets in the early weeks. They were not given the option to quit. If a candidate collapsed from exhaustion, they were revived and ordered to continue. If they refused, they were shocked and ordered again. The message was clear. Failure was not exhaustion was not an excuse. The only acceptable outcome was completion of the assigned task. Following calisthenics, the Spartans would run 1 mile to the Reach Naval Academy for their academic education. This run served multiple purposes. It provided additional physical conditioning. It taught them to function while already fatigued from morning exercise, and it reinforced that they were soldiers first, students second. Their education would be conducted on military terms, not civilian ones. At the Naval Academy, the Spartans were taught artificial intelligence construct named Deja. Unlike the stern, unforgiving Chief Mendez, Deja was gentle and encouraging in her teaching methods. She provided the children with education that was remarkably comprehensive and advanced for their age. The Spartans were taught mathematics and science at levels far beyond standard elementary education. They learned physics that would allow them to calculate trajectory arc and estimate blast radii. They studied chemistry to understand explosive compound and chemical warfare. They were taught biology with a focus on anatomy and the most effective ways to neutralize enemy combatants. They learned military history with particular focus on tactics, strategy. Deja showed them footage of ancient Earth battles, Thermopylae, Cannae, Agincourt, Stalingrad, and analyzed decisions that led to victory or defeat. The very first lesson the Spartans received was a video recording of the 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae, holding a narrow pass against overwhelming Persian forces. The message was explicit. They were being fashioned in the image of history's most legendary warriors. They were taught languages, reading and writing in multiple human tongues, preparing them for operations across UNSC space. They studied psychology to better understand human behavior and predict enemy action. They learned engineering principles that would allow them to sabotage infrastructure or jury-rig equipment in the field. The education was comprehensive, intensive, and explicitly military in its application. These children were not being prepared for civilian careers. They were being prepared to wage war at the highest levels of sophistication. After academic instruction, the Spartans would run 2 miles to what Mendez called the playground. This was a massive aerial obstacle course that tested agility, strength, coordination, and most importantly, teamwork. The course required the candidates to work together to overcome challenges that would be impossible individually. High walls that needed multiple Spartans to scale, rope bridges that required coordinated movement to prevent collapse, platforms that could only be reached by forming human pyramids. At the end of the course hung a bell. The team that rang the bell first completed the exercise. The team that finished last lost their evening meal. This was where the Spartan learned that individual excellence meant nothing without team cohesion. A single strong candidate could not carry an entire team through the course. Only by working together, by coordinating their efforts, by supporting each other's weaknesses with their strengths, could they succeed. It was also where leadership began to emerge organically. Certain candidates, John 117, Kurt 051, Jerome 092, Fred 104, naturally assumed command roles during team exercises. They called out instructions, coordinated movements, made tactical decisions. Others gravitated into support roles, executing orders efficiently and contributing their specific skills to team success. Mendez watched these dynamics closely. He did not appoint leaders. He allowed leadership to emerge naturally, then reinforced subtle teams led by natural leaders were occasionally given advantages, a head start, a hint about course obstacles, teaching the other candidates that following effective leadership brought reward. The training was not static. As the Spartans grew older and more capable, Mendez introduced complications designed to keep them adapting. Stun mines were added to obstacle courses, forcing candidates to watch their footing and coordinate mine clearance. Snipers with paint-marking rounds fired on them during exercise, teaching them to use cover and move tactically, even during supposedly straightforward physical challenges. Trip lines were strung across nighttime infiltration courses. Live ammunition exercise gradually replaced paint rounds as the Spartans grew old enough to handle lethal weapons safely. Medical training was conducted not in classroom, but in field conditions, with candidates learning to treat sucking chest wounds and compound fractures while under simulated fire. Survival exercises became increasingly elaborate. Early versions involved giving the Spartans map fragments and ordering them to navigate to extraction point in Reach's wilderness. Later iterations dropped them in hostile terrain with minimal equipment and required them to survive for days or weeks while evading pursuit. One particularly grueling involved dividing the Spartans into 2 teams and giving one team a head start to establish defensive position. The second team had to locate and eliminate the first. Both teams were armed with stun-delivered, debilitating but non-lethal shock. The exercise taught them to hunt, to hide, to fight against opponents who knew their capability because those opponents were their own brother and sister. These exercises were not without casualties. Several Spartans suffered broken bones during training. Concussions were common. At least one candidate nearly drowned during an underwater infiltration exercise and required emergency resuscitation. Another suffered severe burns during a live fire exercise when accelerant was spilled improperly. Mendez viewed these injuries as acceptable costs. He was creating soldiers who would face enemy fire, alien horrors, and life-or-death situations regularly. Better they learn the cost of mistakes in training than in actual combat. Better they understand viscerally that war has consequence than go into battle with naive confidence. The psychological conditioning was as important as the physical training. From the first day, the Spartans were taught that they were different from normal humans, better, stronger, destined for greatness. This messaging served to build confidence, but also to isolate psychologically from the civilian population they were ostensibly being created to protect. They were taught that emotions were weaknesses to be suppressed. Fear, doubt, hesitation, all were liabilities that could get them or their teammate killed. They learned to compartmentalize, to function under extreme stress, to make life and death decisions without being paralyzed by the weight of those choices. They were taught that the mission was paramount, that individual survival was less important than mission, that they were expected to sacrifice themselves without hesitation if doing so would ensure success or save their teammate. This conditioning would later manifest in Spartans making incredibly brave, tactically sound decisions to trade their lives for strategic advantage. They were also taught, though more subtly, that they could not return to civilian life, that their old identities were gone forever, that the people they had been before reach no longer exist. This messaging was reinforced through the elimination of surnames, through the constant emphasis on their service numbers, through the complete absence of any connection to their pre-Spartan lives. As the years progressed, Spartans internalized these lessons. They stopped talking, stopped mentioning memories of home. A few tried to maintain those connections in the early years, sharing stories about parents or siblings, but were discouraged by both training staff and peer pressure. The other Spartans did not want to hear about the lives they had lost. It was easier to accept that those lives had never existed. The training was not entirely without moments of humanity. Mendez, for all his sternness, recognized that the candidates needed some outlet for their youth. They were allowed limited recreation time, usually spent in competitive games or informal sports. Friendships formed, bonds that would last lifetimes for those. John 117, Kelly 087, Samuel 034, Linda 058, and Frederick 104 formed a particularly close unit in the early years. They worked together on team exercises, covered for each other's weaknesses, pushed each other. This friendship group would later become the core of what would be designated Blue Team, one of the most effective Spartan-fired teams in the war against the Covenant. Others formed their own bonds. Rivals emerged, candidates who competed ferocious but with mutual respect. Mentorships developed, with older or more experienced Spartans helping younger or less capable ones improve. Romances were forbidden and largely prevented by the military structure, but close emotional bonds formed nonetheless. The Spartans also developed their own informal communication system, a mixture of hand signals and subtle gestures that allowed them to coordinate without verbal communication. This system was taught by Mendez or his instructor. It emerged organically from the candidate's need to communicate under conditions where speaking was prohibited or dangerous. Mendez noticed the system, but did not discourage it. He recognized that this kind of initiative and problem-solving was exactly what he wanted to cultivate. Spartans who could adapt, who could create solutions to problems rather than simply following prescribed protocols, would be more effective in the field. By the time the Spartans reached age 14, they had been transformed almost beyond recognition. The confused, frightened 6-year-olds who had arrived on Reach 8 years earlier were gone. In their place stood adolescent warriors with skills that far exceeded standard special forces operatives despite their youth. They could run miles without tiring. They could navigate hostile territory with nothing more than natural landmarks for guidance. They could field strip and reassemble weapons in darkness. They could treat traumatic injuries under fire. They could infiltrate, ambush, sabotage, and kill with cold efficiency. They could work as individual operators or as seamless teams. They could lead or follow depending on what the mission required. They could endure hardships that would break adult soldiers. They could make tactical decisions seconds that other commanders would agonize over for hours. They had been educated to a level that exceeded most university graduates despite their age. They understood physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, history, strategy, tactics, and a dozen other subjects at advanced level. They were fluent in multiple languages. They could analyze intelligence data, plan operations, and execute missions with minimal supervision, and they had completely internalized their identities as Spartan. They no longer thought of themselves as kidnapped children. They were soldiers, warriors, defenders of humanity, strongest, fast, smartest operatives the UNSC had ever produced. The training had accomplished its goal. 75 children had been transformed into weapons, but the transformation was not complete. Physical training and psychological conditioning could only go so far. To become the super soldiers Catherine Halsey had envisioned, the Spartans would need to undergo biological augmentation that would fundamentally alter their bodies at the genetic and cellular level. At age 14, the Spartans were judged ready for the next phase. They were transported to classified medical facilities where the most extensive human augmentation procedures ever attempted would be performed on their still developing bodies. 30 of them would not survive the process. In September of 2525, when the Spartan-II candidates reached age 14, they were transported to special medical group facilities on Reach for the augmentation procedures collectively known as Project Aster. What followed was perhaps the most extreme and invasive biological modification ever performed on human subjects. The procedures would kill 30 candidates outright, cripple 12 more beyond recovery, and leave only 33 functional super soldiers. The augmentation protocol had been developed over years by Dr. Halsey, working in coordination with the Office of Naval Intelligence's bioengineering teams. They represented a mass expansion procedures that had been tested Orion, where Orion had applied to fully mature adult project, fundamentally restructured bodies adult subjects whose bones and organs still developed. The timing critical. The procedures had to be performed after the candidate had undergone their initial growths, but before their skeletal structure fully hardened. Too early, and the augmentation would interfere with addictive. Too late, and the body would be too fixed in its development to accept the radical modifications being imposed. The Spartans were not told what to expect. They knew they would undergo medical procedures. They had been informed that these procedures would make them stronger, faster, more capable. They had not been told about the mortality rate. They had not been told how many of them would die screaming in those medical facilities. They had not been told that the pain would be so intense that it would leave lasting psychological scars even in those who survived. The augmentation procedures were performed over several days, with the candidates kept heavily sedated between interventions to manage pain and reduce the risk of psychological trauma from the experience. Even so, even with the most advanced analgesics and sedatives available, the pain was profound. The first procedure was carbide ceramic ossification. This involved surgically exposing portions of the candidate's skeletal structure and grafting an advanced ceramic material directly into the bone. The ceramic would bond with the existing bone tissue, replacing approximately 3% of the bone's surface area with a virtually unbreakable armor-like matrix. The theoretical result was a skeleton that could withstand impacts that would shatter normal human bones. Spartans would be able to fall from significant heights without fracturing their leg. They could take hits from weapons that would pulverize an unaugmented person's bones. Their skeletons become, in essence, reinforced frames capable of supporting superhuman physical stress. The procedure was crucial. Even under heavy sedation, the candidates experienced the surgery as a wave of agony that felt, according to later debriefings, like their bones were being broken from the inside. The sensation was described as feeling like their marrow had been replaced with shattered glass, every movement sending spikes of pain through their bodies. The 3% limitation was not arbitrary. Medical trials had determined that replacing more than 3% of bone surface with ceramic material caused fatal complications. The calcium phosphate structure of a bone includes spaces for bone marrow where bloods are produced. Too much ceramic placement caused white blood cell necrosis, the death of induction cell, which would leave the subject vulnerable to even minor infections. Several candidates experienced complication carbide ceramification. Rejection reaction occurred when the body's immune system recognized the ceramic as foreign material and attempted to destroy it. Infections developed exposed bone tissue despite sterile surgical protocol. A few candidates suffered catastrophic bone fractures during the procedure when stress from the ceramic bonding underlying bone structures to the second procedure, muscular enhancement through protein complex injection. A specially designed protein compound was injected directly into muscle tissue throughout the body, where it would increase tissue density and decrease lactate recovery time. The enhanced muscles would be significantly stronger than normal human musculature and would recover from exertion far more quickly. This procedure carried approximately a 5% risk of fatal cardiac complication. The protein complex could cause the heart muscle to increase in volume too rapidly, leading to cardiac arrest. Several candidates died, their hearts simply stopping as the enhancement overwhelmed their cardiovascular system. Those who survived the injections experienced a different kind of agony. The protein complex burned as it spread through muscle tissue. Candidates later described the sensation as feeling like their muscles were being dissolved in acid, a deep internal burning that no analgesic could completely suppress. The pain lasted for hours as the protein complex worked its way through their systems, binding with muscle fibers and forcing them to restructure. The third major procedure was the implantation of catalytic thyroid implants. Small pellets of platinum containing a human growth hormone catalyst were surgically implanted into the thyroid gland. These implants would boost the body's production of growth hormone, increasing physical size and bone growth beyond natural parameters. The thyroid implantation carried its own risk. Improper placement could cause thyroid dysfunction, leading to metabolic chaos. Too much growth hormone could cause dangerous overgrowth of organs or bones. Several candidates experienced complications ranging from endocrine disorders to catastrophic cellular mutations triggered by hormone imbalance. The subjective experience of thyroid enhancement was similarly traumatic. Candidates described feeling like their veins had been injected with napalm. They experienced sensations of their veins pulsating and feeling as if they were being torn from their skin. The hormonal surge caused by the implants created a metabolic storm that left them feverish, delirious, and in constant pain for days. Additional procedures rounded out the augmentation protocol. Occipital capillary reversal improved vision by increasing blood flow to the retina and optical nerve. Superconducting fabrication of neural dendrite enhanced nervous system efficiency, increasing reaction time. Muscular and skeletal system alterations beyond the primary injections further refined physical capabilities. Each procedure carried risk, each added to the cumulative physical trauma being inflicted on 14-year-old bodies. The augmentation process was not like upgrading a machine, where components can be swapped cleanly and reliably. This was biological modification at its most invasive, attempting to force human bodies to become something they were never meant to be. The procedures were performed while the candidates were unconscious. Spare them the full psychological impact of what was being done to their bodies. But even in unconscious, the pain. Medical staff reported that candidates screamed during the procedures despite being under deep sedation. They thrashed against restraint. Their vital signs spiked to dangerous levels as their bodies fought against the modification posed. The medical prepared for casual. They had expected survival-based trial, Orion and animal. They knew approximately how many candidates would die. The question was not whether there would be casualties, but whether the survivors would be functional enough to justify the losses. Of 75 candidates who entered augmentation, 30 died. 40% mortality. Causes of death varied: cardiac arrests from muscular enhancement complication, catastrophic bone fractures during ossification, anaphylactic shock from rejection, metabolic collapse, thyroid failure, cerebral hemorrhage, neural dendrite enhancement. Some died quickly, their system simply shutting down in response to trauma. Others lingered for hours or days before succumbing to cascading organ failure. 12 more candidates were crippled, 16% washout. These were the ones whose bodies rejected the augmentations but did not die immediately. Their immune systems attacked the foreign materials, causing chronic inflammation and tissue damage. Their bones fractured repeatedly as the ceramic ossification failed to bond properly. Their muscles atrophied despite the enhancement. Their nervous system suffered permanent damage from neural enhancement. Gone wrong, the crippled candidates were removed from the Spartan program. Their bodies were placed in cryogenic suspension, preserving them in the hope that future medical advances might allow rehabilitation. Some were later revived and given experimental treatment. A few eventually recovered partial function and were recruited into Office of Naval Intelligence roles that could utilize their training despite their physical limitation. Others remained in cryosleep indefinitely. They were not dead, but could not be considered alive in any meaningful sense. They existed in frozen stasis, preserved bodies waiting for technology that might never come. That left 33 survivors, 44% success rate, 33 candidates whose bodies accepted the augmentations, whose systems adapted and rebuilt themselves around the foreign material, whose genetic structures proved robust to survive what amounted to controlled biological catastrophe. These 33 were not unchanged by the experience. The trauma of the augmentation procedures left lasting effects beyond the physical modification. Several candidates experienced ongoing chronic pain from nerve damage or improperly healed tissues. All carried psychological scars from the experience, nightmares about the procedures that would persist for years. 2 of the 33 functional survivors later committed suicide after learning details about the flash clone protocol. The knowledge that their families had mourned clone duplicate combined with the survivors' guilt over being one of only 33 to emerge functional augmentation proved too much to bear. That left 31 Spartan-IIs to be deployed by the United Nations Space Command. But even among those 31, not all were equal. The augmentation procedures had worked better on some than others. Some candidates emerged with spectacular enhancements, exhibiting physical capabilities far beyond the program's baseline expectation. Others were less dramatically enhanced, their bodies having accepted the modifications but not maximized their potential. The most successful augmentations resulted in individuals capable of remarkable. At 14 years old and without armor, the enhanced Spartans could lift 3 times their body weight. They could run at speeds exceeding 55 kilometers per hour. They could react to stimuli with a speed that made them seem to move faster than humanly possible. Their skeletal reinforcement allowed them to survive falls that would kill normal humans. They could take bullets to bone without fracture. They could survive blunt force trauma that would pulverize unaugmented skeleton. The ceramic ossification had succeeded in creating virtually unbreakable bone, at least within human achievable impact parameters. Their enhanced musculature gave them strength far beyond their size. They could punch through material, stop a normal human. They could overpower adult combatants with ease. The muscular enhancements also dramatically reduced their recovery time from exertion. A Spartan could run for miles, engage in extended combat, and be ready for another mission within hours where a normal soldier would need days to recover. The cardiovascular and pulmonary improvements meant they could sustain physical effort far longer than unaugmented humans. Their bodies utilized oxygen more efficiently. Their hearts pumped more blood with each beat. They could operate in an environment with thinner atmospheres that would leave normal humans gasping. The neural enhancements improved their reaction times to the point where they could perceive and respond to threats faster than normal human reflexes allow. This would later prove critical in combat against the Covenant, where the difference between life and death often came down to split-second reaction. The thyroid implants caused Spartans to grow significantly larger than they would have naturally. Most exceeded 2 meters in height. They put on muscle mass that would be impossible for unaugmented humans to achieve naturally. They became physically imposing specimens that towered over normal humans and carried themselves with an almost superhuman presence. But these extraordinary enhancements came with costs beyond the dead and crippled. The surviving Spartans were no longer entirely human in any conventional sense. Their bodies had been fundamentally altered, genetic, skeletal, muscular, and nervous system level. They were stronger, faster, tougher, but they were also othered from species they had been created to protect. They could no longer relate to normal humans physically. Their strength made them dangerous to be around in casual circumstances. More than one Spartan accidentally injured support personnel through simple action. A friendly pat on the shoulder that left bruises, a handshake that crushed fingers. They learned to moderate their strength consciously at all times, to move carefully around unaugmented humans as one might move carefully around children. They also struggled to relate emotionally and psychologically. The trauma of augmentation, combined with 8 years of military conditioning and the psychological isolation of being fundamentally different from everyone around, created individuals who found normal human social interaction bewildering or irrelevant. Romantic relationships were virtually impossible. The Spartans had been conditioned since childhood to suppress emotional attachment. Their augmented bodies had developed differently from normal puberty, with hormonal changes managed and controlled by their enhancement. Many described themselves feeling little to no sexual attraction, their libidos having been essentially suppressed by a combination of condition and biological modification. Some Spartans formed close emotional bonds. Relationships resembled sibling connection, or perhaps military brotherhood at its deepest level. But even these bonds were marked fundamental isolation of their. They were 31 survivors of a program that had taken 75 children and killed or crippled 44 of them. They were weapons who happened to have once been human. Mendez visited the survivors after they had recovered sufficiently from the augmentation procedures. He stood before them in the medical facility, looked at the 33 functional Spartans, soon to be 31 after the suicide, and told them they were extraordinary, that they had accomplished something no other humans had, that they were the elite of the elite, the best warriors humanity had ever produced. He did not mention the 30 who had died, did not acknowledge the 12 who had been crippled, did not speak of the moral questions surrounding what had been done to them. He spoke only of strength, of capability, of the missions that awaited them. The Spartans listened because they had been trained to listen, because following orders was what they did, because they had no other context for understanding their existence than the one the program had provided. They were weapons now. The transformation was complete. What remained was to deploy them into battle and see if the price paid in lives and ethics had been worth it. The final tally of the Spartan-II augmentation procedures revealed a casualty rate that would haunt those involved for the rest of their lives. Of the 75 children who entered the augmentation facility on reach in March 5.85, only 45 emerged functional super soldiers. 30 candidates died during or immediately following procedures, their bodies unable to withstand the massive physiological trauma inflicted upon them. 12 more survived, but were left with crippling disabilities that would prevent them from ever serving as frontline combat operatives. The 30 who died represented a catastrophic failure rate of 40%. In any other military program, such losses would have resulted in immediate cancellation and criminal investigation. But the Spartan-II program operated under levels of classification that placed it beyond normal oversight, and the dire strategics facing humanity meant that even horrific casualties could be rationalized as acceptable loss. Dr. Catherine Halsey would maintain throughout her life that the results fell within predicted parameters for such experimental procedure, though her private journals revealed a woman deeply troubled by the deaths of children she had come to know personally over 8 years training. The manner of death varied among the 30 who did not survive. Some experienced catastrophic organ failure as their bodies rejected the biochemical modification. Their kidneys, livers, or hearts simply gave out under the strain, shutting down despite the best efforts of the medical teams to intervene. Others suffered massive strokes or aneurysm as the modifications to their neural system proved too much for their brains to handle. Several died from what could only be described as systemic collapse, a cascade failure where multiple organ systems shut down simultaneously, overwhelming any possibility of medical intervention. The deaths were not quick or peaceful. The candidates died in agony, their augmented bodies fighting desperately to survive, even as they were consumed by the very modifications meant to enhance them. Some remained conscious until the very end, aware of what was happening to them, calling out for help that could not come, or for parents they would never see again. The medical staff who witnessed these deaths would carry the trauma with them for years after. Many required psychological counseling. Several left the program entirely, unable to continue after what they had witnessed. The 12 who survived but were left disabled faced a different kind of tragedy. Some were paralyzed from the neck down, their spinal modifications having catastrophically failed. Others suffered permanent neural damage that left them with tremor, seizure, or cognitive impairment. Several experienced degenerative conditions that would slowly worsen over time, their modified bodies essentially destroying themselves within. These survivors quietly transferred to classified medical facilities where they would spend the rest of their lives receiving care, hidden away from the galaxy at large, living evidence of the program's terrible cost. The Office of Naval Intelligence made arrangements for these disabled candidates, ensuring they received the best possible medical care while simultaneously ensuring they could never reveal the truth about what had been done to them. Some were assigned support roles where their enhanced intellects could still be utilized despite their physical limitation. Others became test subjects for experimental therapies aimed at reversing or managing their condition. A few simply existed in a kind of limbo, neither fully alive nor truly dead, kept comfortable, but essentially imprisoned by their own broken bodies and the security protocols surrounding the program. For those who knew the disabled candidates personally, their fate was in some way worse than death. The surviving Spartans who had trained alongside these individuals for 8 years, who had formed bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood with them, found it profoundly disturbing to think of their friends trapped in medical facilities, unable to fulfill the purpose for which they had all been trained. There was grief in knowing they had died, but there was a different kind of anguish knowing they had survived, only to be denied everything that might have been survival, meaning the 45 who successfully completed augmentation and emerged as functional Spartan-IIs were forever changed by the knowledge of what their survival had cost. They carried with them the memory of every candidate who had died, every friend who had been crippled. This survivor's guilt became a defining characteristic of the Spartan-IIs as a group. They felt an obligation to justify the sacrifice of those who had not made it, to be worthy of the chance they had been given. This manifested as an almost pathological commitment to the mission, a refusal to fail or give up no matter how desperate the situation. Chief Petty Officer Franklin Mendez recognized the psychological damage that the augmentation casualties had inflicted on the survivors. He worked to channel their grief and guilt into determination and focus, emphasizing that the best way to honor the fallen was to excel in their assigned duties. He organized memorial services that acknowledged each lost candidate by name, ensuring that their sacrifice was remembered. He also maintained strict discipline during the recovery period, giving the survivors structure and purpose at a time when they were vulnerable to despair. The surviving Spartans developed their own rituals and tradition for remembering the fallen. Many carried small memento, a piece of training equipment, a photograph, a name etched into their armor, as reminders of those who had not made it. They spoke of the dead with reverence, telling stories of training exploits, shared experiences, keeping the memories alive. When they went into combat, they fought not just for humanity's survival, but for those who would never have the chance to fight along. Casualty rate would continue to climb as the Spartan-IIs entered active combat. The Battle of Kidnapping, November 25 and 25, claimed Samuel 034, the first Spartan to fall in combat against the Covenant. His death hit the survivors hard, particularly John 1:17, who had been forced to make the decision to leave his best friend behind to die. Samuel's sacrifice became a defining moment for the program, proof that even these superhuman warriors were not invincible, that they could bleed and die like anyone else. Over the following years, more Spartans would fall. The exact number remains classified, with conflicting reports and deliberate misinformation obscuring the true casualty figures. What is known is that by the time the Covenant attacked Reach in 2552, the number of active Spartan-IIs had been significantly reduced from the original 45. Some had died in combat, their bodies left on distant world or lost to void space. Others had been severely wounded and placed in medical suspension, their prognoses uncertain. A handful had simply disappeared during classified their fates unknown even to fellow Spartan. Each loss diminished the program, not just numerically, but emotionally. The Spartan-IIs had been raised together, had formed bonds that went beyond normal friendship or military camaraderie. They were family in the truest sense, united by shared experience and shared suffering that no one outside the program could truly understand. To lose one of their number was to lose a part of themselves. The grief never became easier, never less acute, no matter how many times they experienced. Some Spartans fell in spectacular fashion, their deaths witnessed by many and becoming the stuff of legend within the UNSC. Others died alone on classified mission, their sacrifices known only to their immediate team members and buried under layers of security protocols. The Office of Naval Intelligence carefully controlled the flow of information about Spartan casualties, sometimes reporting deaths that had not occurred or failing to report those that had. This was done partly for operational security. The enemy should never be allowed exactly how many Spartans remain active, but also to maintain morale. The Spartans were symbols of humanity's resistance, icons of hope. To publicly acknowledge their deaths was to admit vulnerability, to suggest that even humanity's greatest warriors could be defeated. The survivors dealt with their losses in different ways. Some, like John 1:17, channeled their grief into an even deeper commitment to the mission, driving themselves harder and harder, refusing to rest or show weakness. Others became more withdrawn, building emotional walls to protect themselves from further pain. A few struggled with what might be termed post-traumatic stress disorder, though the Spartan-II's psychological conditioning and their own warrior culture made them reluctant to acknowledge or address such issues. They had been trained to suppress fear, to push through pain, to never admit weakness. To acknowledge psychological trauma would be to fail those standards. The medical staff who supported the Spartan-II program developed protocols for addressing the unique psychological needs of these warriors. Standard counseling approaches were largely ineffective. The Spartans had been so thoroughly conditioned and had experienced such extraordinary circumstance that civilian psychological models simply did not apply. Instead, the approach focused on maintaining unit cohesion, emphasizing the support Spartans could provide one another, and ensuring that grief and trauma were acknowledged within acceptable parameters while not interfering with operational effectiveness. Dr. Halsey herself struggled with the casualties in ways that few others witnessed. Her public persona remained cool and clinical, focused on the program's strategic value and operational requirement. But her private journals revealed a woman deeply affected by every death, every injury, every loss. She had known these children since they were 6 years old. She had watched them grow, had guided their development, had made the decisions that determined their fate. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, and though she rarely showed it, the burden grew heavier with each casualty report. The Office of Naval Intelligence conducted extensive debriefings after every Spartan casualty, analyzing what had happened, looking for lessons that could be learned, seeking ways to prevent similar in the future. Equipment was modified based on findings. Tactics were adjusted. Training was enhanced to address identified vulnerabilities. In this way, each fallen Spartan contributed to the survival of those who remained, their deaths providing knowledge that might save their brothers and sisters in future engagement. By the time of the fall of Reach in 2552, the surviving Spartan-IIs numbered fewer than 30 active combat. Some reports suggested even lower numbers. The exact figure remains classified to this day, obscured by security protocols and deliberate misinformation. What is certain is that from the original 75 candidates selected in 2517, the vast majority had been lost to death, disability, or disappearance over the program's 35-year history. The few who remained were the toughest, the most skilled, the luckiest, or some combination of all three. These survivors carried with them the cumulative weight of all those lost. They were the last representatives of a program that had sacrificed so much in humanity's defense. They knew that they might well be the last of their kind. The Spartan-II program had never been repeated. The ethical and practical cost deemed too high for even the desperate circumstances of the Human Covenant War to justify a second attempt. They fought with the knowledge that when they fell, there might be no one to replace, that the legacy of the program would die with them. The Spartan-IIs entered active combat operations against the Covenant in late 2525, just months after their augmentation procedures. For the next 27 years, they would be deployed on hundreds of classified missions across human space, fighting in every major theater of the Human Covenant War, and participating in countless smaller engagements that never made it into official historic record. Their operational history represents one of the most remarkable combat records in military history, a testament to their training, their capabilities, and their unflinching commitment to humanity's survival. The early years of the war saw the Spartan-IIs deployed primarily in small teams, conducting surgical strikes against high-value Covenant targets. These missions took advantage of the Spartans' unique capability, their ability to operate in hostile environments, their skill in infiltration and close quarters combat, their capacity to accomplish objectives that would require entire battalions of conventional forces to attempt. They raided Covenant supply bases, captured or killed enemy commanders, sabotaged key installations, and gathered intelligence that proved vital to the UNSC's understanding of their enemy. One of the most significant early deployments came during the Battle of Jericho 7 in 2035. A heavily populated colony came under massive Covenant assault, with invasion forces landing on the surface after devastating orbital bombardment. UNSC conventional forces fought desperately to defend the planet, but they were being overwhelmed by superior Covenant numbers and technology. The Spartan-IIs were deployed to turn the tide. Inserted via orbital drop directly into the worst, the battle demonstrated both the capabilities and the limitations of Spartan-IIs. They fought with devastating effectiveness, breaking Covenant assaults that would have overrun conventional position, conducting raids that destroyed enemy command structures and supply lines, and inspiring the human defenders to superhuman efforts through their mere presence. Eyewitness accounts from Jericho E7 describe Spartans as being everywhere at once, appearing without warning to break enemy attacks before vanishing just as quickly to strike elsewhere. The psychological impact on both friendly and enemy forces was profound, but even Spartans could not hold back an entire invasion fleet indefinitely. As the battle wore on and Covenant reinforcements continued to arrive, it became clear that Jericho 7 could not be saved. The Spartan-IIs participated in the desperate evacuation, fighting rearguard actions that allowed civilian transports to escape while the planet burned around them. They were among the last UNSC forces to withdraw, leaving behind a world in flames and millions of dead. The battle was a defeat, but without the Spartans' intervention, it would have been a complete catastrophe. The pattern established at Jericho VII would repeat throughout the war. The Spartan-IIs were consistently deployed to the most desperate situation, sent to fight battles that conventional forces could not win, tasked with accomplishing objectives that seemed impossible. They raided Covenant shipyards, infiltrated enemy vessels, plant nuclear weapons, or sabotage critical, rescued stranded colony worlds siege, and conducted reconnaissance deep in Covenant-controlled base. Their success rate was extraordinary, with some sources claiming that the Spartan-IIs never failed a mission, though such claims ignore the many operations where success came at terrible cost, or where the objectives themselves proved meaningless in the larger strategic picture. Naval operations represented another crucial area of Spartan-II deployment. The Covenant's technological superiority meant that UNSC ships were typically outmatched fleet engagement. But if a boarding team could infiltrate an enemy vessel, human forces could turn the table. The Spartan-IIs became the UNSC's preferred boarding specialists, their Mjolnir armor allowing them to operate in the vacuum of space and withstand the hazards of ship-to-ship. They executed dozen boardings throughout the war, seizing enemy vessels, recovering alien technology, or simply destroying Covenant ships from within when conventional weapons proved insufficient. The intelligence gathered by Spartan seconds during these boarding operations proved invaluable. They retrieved Covenant data cores, captured enemy personnel for interrogation, and recovered examples of alien technology that only scientists could study and potentially adapt for human use. Much of what humanity learned about Covenant military organization, technology, and capabilities came from Spartan operations. This intelligence allowed the UNSC to develop more effective tactics and occasionally exploit vulnerabilities in Covenant defenses. As the war progressed into the 2540s, the Spartan-IIs found themselves increasingly deployed in defensive operations as the Covenant pushed deeper into human space. The loss of the outer colonies meant that every remaining world became critical to humanity's survival. The Spartans fought to defend colony after colony, buying time for evacuation, holding key positions against overwhelming and conducting counterattacks that temporarily drove back enemy forces. They could not save every world. The Covenant's advantage, numbers, and tech was simply too great, but they ensured that each victory cost the enemy dearly. The Battle of Sigma Octanus IV in 2552 exemplified the defensive role. The Covenant fleet that attacked the colony represented a significant threat, and conventional UN struggling to hold the line. A Spartan team led by John 117 was deployed surface to assist the defense of Côte d'Azur. The Spartans fought through the street, engaging Covenant forces in brutal urban combat. They discovered that the enemy was searching for something specific, ancient artifact in a museum that hinted at the existence of forerunner installations beyond human space. The Spartans succeeded in preventing the Covenant from obtaining the full data from these artifacts, though fragmentary information was transmitted to enemy ships. More importantly, they recovered the artifacts themselves, securing valuable and forerunner installations that would later prove crucial. The battle was another example, Spartan-II's turning potential disaster into qualified success, accomplishing their objectives even in the midst of chaos structure. Throughout these years of combat, the Spartan-IIs developed reputations as individual operative team leaders. John 1:17 emerged as perhaps the most effective Spartan. His combination of tactical brilliance, exceptional combat skills, and almost supernatural luck, making him the go-to operative for the most difficult missions. He led numerous operations that became legendary within ONI, though the classified nature of much of his work meant that most of his achievements would never be publicly acknowledged. Kelly E-027 became renowned for her speed, enhanced even beyond that of her fellow Spartans through some quirk of her augmentation or natural physiology. She could move faster than seemed physically possible, a blur that could close distance with enemy before they could react or evade incoming fire. Through sheer speed, her capabilities made her invaluable for time-critical missions where speed was essential. Fred 104 established himself as a brilliant tactical mind and an exceptional team leader in his own right. He commanded Blue Team on numerous operations, often working in parallel with John 117's teams on complex multi-objective missions. His leadership style emphasized careful planning and precise execution, balancing aggression with calculated risk management. Linda 05D8 became the Spartan-II's premier sniper, capable of impossibly long-range shots with consistency that seemed to defy probability. Her calm demeanor and patience made her ideal for overwatch positions where she could eliminate key targets from distances measured in kilometers. She was critically wounded during the fall of Reach and placed in cryogenic suspension, only to be revived later and return to active service. Other Spartans distinguished themselves in different ways. Some became demolitions experts, masters at using explosives to achieve objectives that firepower alone could not accomplish. Others specialized in infiltration, capable of penetrating even heavily secured enemy positions without detection. Several became combat engineers, able to repair or modify equipment in the field, keeping their team's gear operational under the most adverse conditions. The diversity of skills and specializations among the Spartan-IIs made them adaptable to virtually any mission profile. The Spartan-IIs also worked extensively with other branches of the UN military. They fought alongside orbital drop shock troopers, the elite conventional infantry known as hell jumpers. They coordinated with ONI operatives on intelligence gathering missions. They supported major fleet actions by conducting raids that disabled enemy vessels or installations. These joint operations were not always smooth. Conventional forces sometimes resented the Spartans' elite status or found it difficult to work with warriors who operated on a completely different level of capability. But over time, most UNSC personnel who fought alongside Spartans came to respect and even revere them. The psychological impact of Spartan operations extended beyond the battlefield. Within the UNSC military, stories of Spartan heroics became legendary, spreading through informal channels even when official reports remained classified. Soldiers told stories of 7-foot armored giants who could flip tanks, who shrugged off wounds that would kill normal humans, who never retreated and never surrendered. These stories, embellished through repeated telling, created a mythology around the Spartan-IIs that served to boost morale across human force. If the Spartans were fighting, many soldiers reasoned, then there was still hope. The Covenant, too, came to fear the Spartan. Enemy forces learned that when the armored human warriors appeared, defeat and death would follow. Some Covenant troops would break and flee when Spartans entered the battle, their morale shattered by previous encounters with these seemingly invincible opponents. Covenant commanders developed specific tactics for dealing with Spartan threat, recognizing conventional approaches were often ineffective. The aliens called them demons, a term that the Spartan-IIs would eventually adopt as a badge of honor. But for all their success, the Spartan-IIs could not change the fundamental strategic reality of the war. Humanity was losing. For every victory the Spartans achieved, A dozen colonies fell to Covenant assault. For every enemy ship they destroyed, 3 more appeared to take its place. The Covenant's advantages in technology, numbers, and industrial capacity were simply too great. The Spartan-IIs were a scalpel, capable of precise and devastating strikes, but the war demanded sledgehammers and the deployment force on a scale even these superhuman warriors could not. The Spartans themselves understood this reality. They fought knowing that they were buying time rather than final victory, holding the line rather than pushing the enemy back. They saw world after world burn, watched billions of humans die, and understood that for all their capabilities, they could not save everyone. This knowledge added another psychological burden to the many they already carried. The frustration of knowing that their best efforts were not enough, that no matter how many battles they won, humanity continued to lose the war. By 25 the Spartan-IIs had been fighting continuously for 27 years. They had endured wounds, witnessed the deaths of combat, and accumulated psychological trauma that would have broken lesser individuals. Their Mjolnir armor bore the scars of countless engagements, repaired so many times that little of the original material remained. They themselves carried visible and invisible scars, augmented bodies that had been pushed to their limit, mind that had seen more horror than any human should have to witness. Yet they continued to fight. When the Covenant finally located Reach in August 25 and launched a massive assault on humanity's most important military stronghold, the Spartan-IIs were there to defend it. They fought on the ground, space, conducting desperation to buy time for civilian evacuation and to safeguard critical assets. Most of the remaining Spartan believed lost during the fall, though some would later be revealed to have survived through various circumstances. John 1:17 would go on to discover Halo installation ESO 4 to destroy that ring and prevent the Covenant from activating a weapon that would have wiped out all sentient life in the galaxy. His actions at Halo, at Earth, and eventually at the Ark would prove decisive in humanity's ultimate survival. But he could not have accomplished any of it without the training, the augmentation, and the experiences that the Spartan-II program had provided him. He was the product of 35 years of preparation, the culmination of Dr. Halsey's vision, and the sacrifice of all those who had not survived to see the war's end. The Spartan-II program's legacy is one of the most complex and controversial aspects of the human Covenant War. On one hand, the program produced warriors who achieved things that seemed impossible, who turned the tide of battles, and who became symbols of humanity's refusal to surrender in the face of extinction. On the other hand, the program was built on a foundation of crime, kidnapping, child endangerment, human experimentation, and the sacrifice of children who had no say in their own fate. The moral questions raised by the Spartan-II program remain unresolved even decades after the war's end. The most fundamental question is whether the ends justified the means. Did the victories achieved by the Spartan-IIs, the lives they saved, and the hope they inspired justify the kidnapping of 75 children and the deaths or disabilities inflicted on nearly half of them? This question admits no easy answer. Those who defend the program point to the existential threat humanity faced. The Covenant was committed to the complete extermination of the human race. In such circumstances, they argue, extraordinary measures were not just justified, but necessary. The Spartans saved world, prevented the activation of the Halo array, and ultimately contributed to humanity's survival. How can such results be dismissed or condemned? Critics counter that the use of children as subjects for dangerous experimentation violated fundamental ethical principles that should never be compromised regardless of circumstance. The children selected for the Spartan-II program were given no choice in their participation. They were abducted from their homes and families, subjected to brutal training and augmentation procedures that killed or crippled many of them, and molded into weapons without regard for their rights or desires. That some of them achieved great things does not erase the crime of what was done to them. Moreover, critics argue that humanity should not have to sacrifice moral principles to survive. If survival requires such compromise, then perhaps what survives is no longer worth defending. The involvement of Dr. Catherine Halsey in the program remains particularly controversial. Halsey conceived the program, selected the candidates, designed the augmentation procedures, and oversaw the training. She made every critical decision about how the program would operate. To her defenders, she is a visionary who made difficult choices under impossible circumstances, who saved humanity through her brilliance and determination. To her critics, she is a war criminal who experimented on children and whose work represents an unforgivable violation of medical ethics and human rights. Halsey herself struggled with these questions throughout her life. Her journals reveal a woman who understood the moral weight of her actions, but who believed that the stakes were high enough to justify even terrible choices. She loved the Spartans in her own, viewing them as her children despite having stolen family. She took pride in their accomplishments while grieving every cat. She defended the program's necessity while privately questioning whether she had become a monster in humanity's service. The complexity of her feelings defies simple moral judgment. The fate of the Flash clone used to replace the abducted children adds another layer of ethical horror to the program. These clones were genetically identical to the children replaced, but suffered from accelerated aging and genetic degradation that ensured they would die within months or years. The clones were essentially created to die, to provide cover for the abductions by making the children's disappearances seem like natural deaths from rare medical conditions. The clones themselves were never acknowledged as individuals with rights or moral worth. They were simply tools, expendable components of the deception. The parents who lost children to the Spartan-II program bore a unique burden of grief. They watched their children sicken and die, never knowing that these were not truly their sons and daughters, but imperfect copies. Some parents noticed behavioral changes before the deaths. The clone, despite genetically identical, lacked the memory and personality traits of the original. But these discrepancies were attributed to illness or psychological factors. The parents grieved, moved on with their lives, never learning the truth. The few who did eventually discover what had happened through investigation, leaked information, or chance encounter, faced the trauma of learning that their children had been stolen, and the grief they had processed was based on a lie. The Spartan-IIs themselves had complicated feelings about their origins and purpose. Many fully embraced their role as humanity's defenders, finding meaning and identity in their service. They had been raised to be soldiers, trained from early childhood to fight and die if necessary for humanity's survival. For many, this purpose was not something imposed on them, but something they had internalized so completely that they could not imagine being anything else. When asked if they resented what had been done to them, some Spartans genuinely could not understand the question. They were what they were, and they would not change it, even if they could. Others harbored more ambivalent feeling. Some experienced flashback memories of their original family, fragmentary recollection before their abduction that suggested lives they've lived. Some wondered what they might have become if they had been allowed normal hoods, whether they would have been happier or more fulfilled. A few actively resented what had been done to them, though they continued to serve because it was all they knew how to do. The psychological indoctrination and conditioning they had undergone made it difficult for them to fully process or express feeling, adding another dimension to the ethical violation they had suffered. The UNSC's official position on the Spartan-II program has evolved over time. During the war, the program remained highly classified, with even its existence denied at the highest level. After the war, as information gradually became public through various channels, the military initially maintained that the program had been necessary and justified by result. Over time, as public awareness of the ethical violations grew, the official stance shifted to acknowledgement that mistakes were made, but that the desperate circumstances of the war required extraordinary measure. Full disclosure has never been provided, and many records are classified under protocols that will keep them sealed for decades, centuries. Public opinion about the Spartan-IIs is similarly divided. Many view them as heroes who saved humanity, worthy of honor and gratitude regardless of the circumstances of their creation. Others see them as victims who deserve sympathy and support. Some view them with suspicion or fear, uncomfortable with the existence of superhuman warriors whose capabilities and loyalties are not fully understood. Veterans of the Covenant War generally hold the Spartans in the highest regard, having witnessed their effectiveness firsthand and understanding the desperate context in which they operate. The question of accountability remains largely unresolved. Dr. Halsey was eventually arrested and charged with multiple crimes related to the Spartan-II program, though the proceedings were complicated by classification and the fact that she had parading with official authorization throughout. Many of those who authorized or supported the program were dead, either killed during the war or having died of natural causes in the decades since. Those who remained pointed to the chain of command and official authorizations to argue that they were following orders or implementing approved policy. The question of who bears ultimate responsibility for the program's ethical violations has never been satisfactorily answered. The Spartan-II program also raised questions about military enhancement and human augmentation more broadly. If creating super soldiers through childhood abduction and dangerous experimentation was wrong, what about the Spartan-III program that followed, which used orphaned children whose homes had been destroyed by the Covenant? What about the Spartan-IV program, which augmented adult volunteers? Where is the ethical line between acceptable military enhancement and unacceptable human experimentation? These questions became increasingly relevant as augmentation technology continued to advance in the post-war period. The success of the Spartan-II program also created practical problems for the UNSC, having demonstrated that enhanced soldiers could achieve things conventional forces could not. The military became increasingly dependent on Spartans for critical operation. This created a dangerous concentration of capability. Too many missions required Spartan-level performance, and there were too few Spartans to meet the demand. The Spartan-III and Spartan-IV programs were attempts to address this shortage, but neither fully replicated the capabilities Spartan-II. The military found itself in the uncomfortable position of needing more of something that it could not ethically create. The Spartans who survived the war faced their own challenges in the post-period. They had spent their entire life at war, had known nothing but training and combat's early childhood. What place was there in a peacetime galaxy? Some continued to serve in military roles, their skill experience too valuable to waste. Others struggled to adapt to peace, finding civilian life incomprehensible. The psychoma they carried, decade of combat, survivor's guilt, the burden of being living required treatment support the UNSC poorly equipped to provide. John 1:17, famous Spartan-IIs, became a symbol of humanity's victory over the Covenant. His status as hero and icon brought its burden. He was expected to embody humanity's hopes and values, to serve as an example of what humans could achieve when pushed to their limit. But he was also a victim of the Spartan-II program, a kidnapped child who had been turned into a weapon. The complexity of his position, simultaneously hero and victim, symbol and individual, reflected the broader contradictions inherent in the Spartan legacy. The question of whether the Spartan-II program should ever be repeated remains a matter of debate. Most agree that the ethical violations involved in the original program cannot be justified in peacetime. But if humanity faced another existential threat, another enemy committed to its extermination, would similar measures become acceptable again? The precedent has been the knowledge of what can be achieved through childhood augmentation and intensive training exists. If the choice came down to extinction or repeating the crimes of the Spartan-II program, what should humanity choose? Some argue that this framing is itself problematic, that it assumes the the Spartan-II program was truly necessary for humanity's survival when other approaches might have achieved similar results without the ethical violation. Perhaps with different leadership or different priority, the UNSC could have developed alternative responses to the Covenant threat that did not require the sacrifice of children. Perhaps Spartan's success has blinded humanity to the fact that their creation was not inevitable or necessary, but rather one choice among many, and not necessarily the right one. The families of the original Spartan-II candidate, those who eventually learned the truth, formed support groups to process their grief and advocate for accountability. These families argue that their children were stolen from them, that the grief they experienced Flash clones died was real, even if the deaths were not, and that nothing can compensate for what was taken from. Some have called for official acknowledgement and apology, the UNSC and the UEG. Others have demanded surviving Spartan be given the opportunity to reconnect with their birth choose. Though many Spartans have shown little interest in pursuing such connection, the scientific community has debated whether the knowledge gained from the Spartan suit augmentation procedures should be preserved and studied or destroyed to prevent its potential misuse. The procedures represented significant advances in biomedical science. Insights into human enhancement could potentially benefit everyone if properly applied, but they were also gained through unethical experimentation. Children, and many argue that such knowledge is tainted at its source and should not be used. The compromise has been to classify the information at the highest levels while allowing limited research under strict ethical oversight. In the end, the legacy of the Spartan-II program remains deeply ambiguous. It saved humanity from extinction, this much is certain. The Spartans achieved things that no one else could have accomplished, turned the tide of battles that would otherwise have been lost, and inspired hope when hope seemed impossible. They were heroes in the truest sense, individuals who sacrificed everything in service of something greater than themselves. But they were also victims, children robbed of their childhoods and their choices, subjected to horrors that no one should have to endure, and molded into weapons without regard for their own humanity or rights. 30 of them died in agony during augmentation procedures. 12 more were crippled for life. Many of the survivors fell in combat, dying in classified operations that would never be acknowledged. Those who lived carry scars, both visible and invisible, trauma that will never fully heal. The uncomfortable truth is that both things can be true simultaneously. The Spartan-IIs can be heroes and victims, their program both necessary and unforgivable. Humanity can owe its survival to them while acknowledging that what was done to them was wrong. These contradictions cannot be resolved or explained away. They must simply be carried, acknowledged, and remembered. As humanity moved forward into the post-war period, the Spartan-II program served as a reminder of the prices that had been paid for survival, the moral compromises that had been made, the sacrifices of children who never had the chance to choose their own fate. Whether that price was worth paying, whether those compromises were justified, whether those sacrifices should be honored or mourned. These questions do not have clear answers. Perhaps they cannot have clear answers. Perhaps the only honest response is to acknowledge the complexity, to honor the Spartans for what they achieved while condemning what was done to them, to be grateful for humanity's survival while grieving the innocence and principles that were lost along the way. The Spartan-IIs stand as humanity's greatest warriors and humanity's greatest shame. They are a testament to what humans can achieve when pushed to their absolute limits, and a warning about what humans are willing to do when desperate enough. Their story is not a comfortable one, not a simple tale of heroism or villainy, but something far more complicated and far more human in its contradiction and compromise. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Spartan-II program, not a lesson about military effectiveness or strategic necessity, but a reminder that in war, especially in wars of extinction, There are no clean hands. Everyone who survives does so because someone else paid a price. Everyone who fights carries burdens that never fully lift. Everyone who makes it through to the other side is changed by the experience, often in ways that cannot be undone. The Spartan-IIs paid that price. They carried those burdens. They were changed in ways that could never be reversed, and humanity survived because they did. Whether that was worth it is a question each person must answer. Thank you for watching this deep dive Spartan-II program. If you found this exploration of Halo valuable, please like this video and subscribe to Archivum Halo for more comprehensive examinations of the Halo universe. Your support allows us to continue creating detailed, thoughtful content about the stories and histories that make this setting so rich and compelling. Until next time, Spartans, stay strong.